Grief is not the opposite of love. It is love with nowhere left to go. That line has stayed with me for a long time, longer than most things I've read about loss. And tonight, sitting here with these stories gathered from 7 traditions across Asia, I find myself thinking about how many people are lying awake right now carrying something they haven't found words for yet. Maybe that is you. Maybe you lost someone, and the world kept moving in a way that felt almost insulting. Maybe you lost something quieter than a person, a version of yourself, a relationship, a life you believed was still ahead of you. Maybe you don't even know exactly what you're grieving. You only know that tonight. The weight of it followed you to bed. That is not weakness. That is not failure. That is what it means to have loved something real. If you feel like it, leave one word in the comments. Just one word for what you're carrying tonight. No explanation needed. No punctuation required. Just the word, as honestly as you can offer it. I've been sitting with these particular stories for several weeks now, and there is one that I kept returning to without quite knowing why, until I realized it was because it doesn't offer comfort the way comfort is usually offered. It offers something older than comfort. You'll feel what I mean when we arrive there. Tonight, these stories come from the Thai forest tradition of northeast Thailand. From the mountains of Tibet, both Kagyu and Nyingma lineages from a hermit's hut in 18th century Japan, from the bamboo forests of Vietnam, and from the stone halls of ancient Korea. Each tradition approached grief differently. Each found, in its own language and its own landscape, that grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a passage, and there is a difference between the two. These stories are contemplative in nature, not medical or therapeutic advice. They are offered simply as company for your night. So now, let your shoulders settle. Let your jaw unclench, just slightly. You do not have to hold yourself together right now. Whatever you've been carrying through this day, you are allowed to set it down for a while. Not forever. Just for tonight. Let your breath arrive without your help. It will come. It always does. And let whatever comes next, whether it is sleep, or tears, or simply a few hours of quiet, be welcome. In the rainy season of 1971, in the Seon region of northeast Thailand, the forest around Wat Nong Pa Pong held the kind of stillness that only arrives after many days of continuous rain. The paths between the monks' kuti huts had turned to soft red mud, the color of fired clay, and the sala, the open-sided hall where teachings were given, smelled of damp teak and incense ash and the particular sweetness of wet earth rising through old wooden floorboards. Oil lamps burned at the 4 corners of the teaching platform, their flames barely moving in the thick, humid air. Geckos clicked from the ceiling rafters. Somewhere beyond the boundary wall, a water buffalo shifted its weight in the dark. The rains in that part of Thailand came not as a gentle falling but as a sustained presence, the sky leaning down onto the high canopy of dipterocarp trees. The sound of water everywhere at once, on the broad, waxy leaves of banana plants along the monastery wall, on the clay roof tiles that had been repaired by monks each dry season for 17 years. In the channels cut along the paths to carry runoff toward the rice paddies beyond the boundary. Frogs called from the drainage ditches in overlapping waves that built and subsided and built again. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a single nightjar repeated its hollow, 2-note call with the patience of someone who has stopped expecting an answer. The monastery had been established in 1954 in an uninhabited grove near the village of Bangor that the local people had long considered haunted, a place of cobras and restless spirits. Difficult terrain with no obvious appeal except its distance from ordinary life. The monk who had chosen it said that was precisely why it was right. A forest monastery, in his view, needed to be inconvenient. Inconvenience kept people honest. The monks here woke before 4 in the morning. They ate one meal each day from their alms bowls. They slept in small wooden huts raised on stilts above the forest floor. Each hut just large enough for a sitting mat, a mosquito net, and whatever practice was happening inside the mind. There was no electricity. There was no comfort in the conventional sense. There was, according to those who had spent time there, a very specific quality of stillness that was available in no other way. The teacher who had built this place was a man in his early 50s by then, compact, unhurried in his movements, with a broad face that had weathered into something open and unguarded. He had been ordained as a novice at 9 years old, had spent years walking the forests of Thailand as an ascetic, had sat in cremation grounds at night watching the quality of his own fear, and had arrived, somewhere in those years of wandering, at a relationship with impermanence that was neither resignation nor indifference, but something more honest than either. He had watched his own father die. He had walked away from comfort many times. He understood loss not as a concept, but as something that had passed through him repeatedly. The way wind passes through bamboo, leaving the bamboo changed in no visible way, but changed nonetheless. He was known throughout the province simply as Luang Por, Venerable Father. The name said nothing about rank or accomplishment, and everything about what people felt when they were in his presence, not safety exactly, since he could be direct to the point of bluntness, but something that functioned like safety, the sense that they would not be managed, or comforted falsely, or told what they wanted to hear. That particular evening, after the formal sitting had ended and the monks had dispersed to their huts for evening practice, a woman arrived at the outer gate of the monastery. She had walked for 4 hours through the mud from her village, carrying a cloth bag and a small offering of sticky rice wrapped in fresh banana leaf. She was perhaps 50 years old, though the lines at the corners of her eyes and the particular set of her jaw suggested a life that had packed considerably more than 50 years into its passage. She wore the dark indigo cotton of a working woman from the countryside, her feet bare and stained from the path, her hair pulled back with the practicality of someone who had stopped thinking about such things. The monastery attendant who found her at the gate said afterward that she was not crying. She had, he said, the look of someone who had finished crying some time ago, weeks ago, perhaps months, and now found herself in the unfamiliar territory that lies on the other side of tears, where the grief remains but the relief of weeping is no longer available. Her name was Bunme. Her youngest son, a boy of 19 years, had died 3 months before the rainy season began. Not from illness, not from the conscription that had taken so many young men from the region in those years, but from an accident in the fields on an ordinary morning in late March, a moment of misjudgment with the bamboo cutter, a sound that his older brother, working nearby, would replay in memory for years. The morning had been bright and cool, the kind of morning that northeast Thailand offers in the weeks before the hot season arrives. And then the morning was the same, except that Bunme's youngest son was no longer part of it. The village monk had performed the funeral rites correctly. The merit-making ceremony had been observed. Neighbors had brought food. and the food had been eaten, and life in its outward form had resumed, her husband returning to the fields, her other children to their households, the ducks that her youngest had fed each morning continuing to need feeding, now by someone else. The machinery of ordinary life had reassembled itself around the hole his absence made. The way water fills a depression in the earth, and Bunme had found herself wondering if the world's capacity to simply continue was something to be grateful for or something to be horrified by. She woke each morning before the light. She lay in the dark for a few minutes before the day could claim her. In those minutes, the grief was always there, not as thought, not as image, not as the replaying of particular memories, but as a physical presence in the center of her chest, a weight of a very specific quality. Not sharp, not breathtaking, simply heavy. In the way that a stone is heavy, not because it is doing anything to you, but because you are holding it. She had tried to meditate, as the village monks had suggested. She had sat and watched her breath. Each time she closed her eyes, her son's face appeared, not distorted by grief, not a nightmare image, simply his face, the specific way he looked while concentrating on something, the small frown of effort he had worn since childhood. She didn't know whether she was supposed to push that image away or allow it, or what the correct response to a dead child's face appearing in meditation was. And none of the monks she had asked had given her an answer that felt like it had been given by someone who had actually loved anyone. She had heard about the teacher at Wat Nong Pa Pong from a neighbor, who had heard from a monk passing through the district. They said he spoke plainly. They said he didn't arrange difficult things into palatable shapes. They said, with a slight mixture of admiration and wariness, that he said exactly what he saw. She had wrapped the sticky rice and begun walking before she was entirely sure what she expected. The attendant brought her to the outer edge of the sala and asked her to wait. She sat on a low wooden bench, listening to the forest drip. Oil lamps shifted in the slight movement of air. A large brown gecko crossed the ceiling beam above her without haste. After approximately 20 minutes, she did not have a watch, but counted the nightjar's calls. The teacher appeared from the direction of his kuti, walking slowly along the path with his walking stick, his robe dark at the hem from contact with the wet grass. He climbed the steps to the teaching platform, arranged his robe, and placed his walking stick across his knees. He looked at her in a way that was neither searching nor pitying, simply present, simply there. "You've come a long way," he said. "Yes, Luangpor. Tell me." She told him, not with the composed account she had rehearsed during the 4-hour walk, the facts arranged in proper order, the respectful framing, the way a person presents a case to someone with authority. The rehearsed version dissolved when she opened her mouth, the way rehearsed things do in the presence of genuine attention. And what came out instead was the actual shape of the grief, fragmentary, circling back, stopping without warning at unexpected moments. She told him about the morning, about her older son's face when he came to find her, about the banana leaf wrapping the sticky rice for the merit-making ceremony, about how she had caught herself, 2 days after the funeral, automatically making a third portion of rice at dinner before she remembered. She told him about waking before dawn. She told him about the ducks. She told him that the grief sat in the center of her chest, at the sternum, and that it did not move and did not lessen and did not respond to anything she had tried, and that she had stopped trying to make it do anything and now simply carried it through each day like an additional task. The teacher listened. He did not adjust his expression at the expected moments. He did not offer the small sounds of sympathy that signal to a speaker that they are being heard in the comfortable sense. He received what she said the way the forest floor receives rain, not performing reception. Simply receiving. Completely. Without storing it up as something that would need to be processed later. When she finished, the forest dripped. The nightjar called. A minute passed in silence that felt, for reasons Bunme could not have articulated, completely appropriate. Then the teacher said, "Is the grief heavy or light?" She did not understand the question at first. "Heavy," she said. "Very heavy." "And where?" She touched her sternum with 2 fingers. "Good," he said. "That is an honest answer. Most people cannot say where their grief lies. They say it is everywhere, or they say they feel nothing at all. You know exactly where yours is, and you can point to it. That precision is already a kind of clarity." She waited. "Now," he said, and his voice was unhurried, without performance. The voice of someone who had sat in this kind of conversation many times and never found it routine. "I want to say something that may not arrive as comfort, but I am asking you to hold it in your hands for a while before you decide what it is." She nodded. "Your son's life was complete." He paused to let that sit separately from everything else. Not shortened. Not taken. Complete the way a breath is complete when it ends. The way a season is complete when it turns. A rice plant has a beginning and an end. We do not say the rice plant whose season is finished has been robbed. We say, it completed. The ending is part of the wholeness, not a violation of it. Bunme was quiet. She was aware that she did not entirely agree and did not entirely disagree. The weight in her chest had not moved. "But Luang Po," she said, and her voice was low and careful. "He was 19. "Yes," the teacher said. "And the lotus that opens for 1 day is not less of a lotus than the one that opens for 3. The measure is not the duration. The measure is what happened in the duration." He looked at her with a directness that was not unkind. "Tell me something your son did that you loved." She thought for a moment. Several things appeared simultaneously, and she chose one. He used to wake early to feed the ducks before school. Without being asked. He just did it every morning. For years. Since he was perhaps 8 years old. Every morning. The teacher said. For years. Since he was 8. He is 19 when he dies, so perhaps 11 years of mornings. How many mornings is that? She had not thought of it in this way before. Perhaps 4,000, she said slowly. 4,000 mornings, the teacher said quietly, of a boy rising before daylight, in all weathers. In the cold, dry season mornings, and the hot mornings before the rains, and the wet mornings, when the path to the duck pen is thick mud, rising each time to care for creatures smaller and more vulnerable than himself, without being asked, without expecting acknowledgement, because that was simply who he was. He paused. Is that a small life? Something shifted then. Not dramatically, not the dissolution of grief. Not a sudden understanding that rearranged everything, but a slight turning of the thing in her chest. As if what she had been holding had been rotated by a small degree, and she could see, for the first time, a face of it that had always been there, but that she had not been looking at. The grief is real. The teacher said, I am not here to argue with you about the grief. It is real, the way rain is real. You do not argue with rain. You do not tell it that it has no right to fall. And you also do not stand in it and insist it has no right to stop. Oppose. What I am asking you to notice, not believe, not accept, simply notice, is whether, beneath the grief, there is also something that is not grieving, something that watches the grief arrive, something that watched it arrive months ago, that is watching it tonight, that will watch it, slowly and in its own time, shift its weight. She looked at him. There is a part of you, he said, that your son cannot take with him when he goes. Not because it did not love him, but because it is older and deeper than both love and loss. It is the awareness that holds the grief rather than the grief itself. It has always been there. It was there before he was born. It is there right now, in this sala, in the sound of the rain on the roof and the lamp flame and the nightjar out in the trees. It will be there tomorrow before dawn when you wake and the grief sits down beside you in the kitchen. Bunme looked at her hands in her lap. The attendant had placed a cup of warm tea at her elbow at some point, and she had not noticed. The teacher was quiet for a while. Outside, the rain intensified briefly, the roof tiles loud with it, and then eased again. You asked me how to find that part, he said, though she had not yet asked it. You just did. The asking itself, the fact that you walked 4 hours in the mud to find something beyond the grief, that you trusted that something beyond the grief exists, that is the awareness recognizing itself. The question is the answer. The seeking is the finding. Bunme was quiet for a long time. Eventually she said, "The weight is still there." "Yes," the teacher said. "It will be. For some time. And one day you will notice that it has not gone, but that you have grown around it. Not that you love him less. That you have become larger. Large enough to hold the love and the grief both. And still have room remaining." He looked at her with an expression that was not pity and not wisdom performing and not the careful compassion of someone managing a difficult conversation. It was simply recognition, one human being recognizing another who is in the middle of the most honest experience available to us. "Go and sleep," he said. "Let the body rest even if the mind does not. The body knows how to do this. It has been doing it since before you knew how to grieve." She walked home the following morning through the lifting mist. The mud path softened to something almost gentle under bare feet. The grief was still in her chest in exactly the same location, the same specific weight. She noticed, somewhere near the 3rd kilometer of the walk, that she was also aware of the mist on her forearms, the smell of the rice paddies waking to the sun, the sound her feet made in the mud. These things existed alongside the grief, not replacing it, not diminishing it, but present in the same moment with it. She had not realized, until that walk, that she had stopped noticing the morning. She returned to the monastery 3 more times that year. On the 3rd visit, she brought her neighbor's daughter, whose husband had died in the summer. She did not describe what the teacher had said or explain the particular turn that the conversations had taken. She only said, to the neighbor's daughter, who was still in the early, exhausted stages of grief, where every conversation requires effort. He listens in a way that makes the weight different, not lighter. Different. That is perhaps the truest account of what these ancient traditions offer in their long engagement with loss. Not the removal of grief, not its transformation into something acceptable and resolved and tidy, but a gradual, patient widening of the one who carries it so that the grief, unchanged, begins to take up a smaller proportion of the total space available. The rain and the awareness of the rain, the grief and the awareness of the grief, the love that has nowhere left to go, and the vast, quiet, unchosen space in which it can be gently, slowly, over time, received. Feel that space now, if you are able, not as a concept, as a sensation. The weight of your body in the bed, specific and here. The temperature of the air at the back of your throat as you breathe. The slight sound of the room around you. These sensations are not the grief, and they are not separate from the grief. They are simply here, the wider room in which everything else is held. Let your shoulders soften toward the mattress. Let the back of your neck release, just slightly. You have been holding yourself together today, perhaps for many days. You are allowed, in this hour, to simply be held. Breathe, and breathe again. And as that tenderness begins to settle, as the body remembers that it knows how to do this, that it has done it every night of your life, we travel now to another mountain, in another century, to Tibet, in the early 12th century, where a man who had trained as a healer and loved a woman completely was about to learn that grief, when carried with enough honesty and enough courage, does not destroy. It builds. It becomes, in time, the very ground on which something lasting can be made. Let your awareness rest in your chest for a moment, right where you have been carrying whatever you carry tonight. You don't need to do anything with it. Just let it be felt and known and accompanied. Then let the next story begin. In the Dakpo district of central Tibet, in the winter of the year that Western calendars would mark as 1104, the mountains held their snow with the particular stillness of a cold so established it had stopped feeling like an event and had simply become the texture of the world. The passes between valleys were sealed. The sky above the high ridges was a blue so clear and hard it looked as though it had been cut from something solid. Below the snow line, in the valleys where the sparse juniper trees grew in clusters between outcroppings of grey stone, the air smelled of wood smoke and dried dung fuel and the faint mineral coldness of frozen ground. In a stone house at the edge of one of these valleys, a house with thick walls and small windows whose wooden shutters had been fitted with care against the wind, a young man sat beside a butter lamp and listened to the sound of his wife's breathing change. He was 25 years old. He had trained as a physician, studying the Tibetan medical tradition that encompassed all three lineages, Indian, Chinese, and the native Tibetan systems, and he had practiced for several years with a reputation that had spread well beyond his home district. People came to him from 3 valleys away. Mothers brought sick children to his door in the early morning. He could read a pulse the way other men read weather, finding, in its subtle variations, information about the body's interior that most people never learned to hear. He had saved lives, enough of them that he had come to believe, not arrogantly but quietly, in the reliable relationship between careful knowledge and good outcome. His name was Zunam Rinchen, which means precious accumulation of merit. Though in those years, before the Dharma name and the monastic vows and the long walk across Tibet to find a strange green-skinned yogi living in a cave, he was known simply as the doctor from Dakpo, or sometimes as the doctor whose wife was the most beautiful woman in the district, a description that embarrassed him deeply and that she found endlessly amusing. He had married her when he was 19, young even for those times. Because the meeting had been so immediately clear to both of them that delay had seemed unnecessary. She was the daughter of a man named Chim Jose Dharma Wo, a moderately prosperous landowner with exacting standards for his daughter's future. Sonam Rinchen had passed those standards without appearing to notice them, which the father had, after initial wariness, found reassuring. The young physician was serious about his work, gentle in his manner, and had the particular quality rare enough to be remarkable of listening to people without appearing to be waiting for them to finish. Their first years together had a quality that both of them recognized, without naming it, as extraordinary in its ordinariness. They had a child, a daughter, and then a second child, a son. The house was warm in winter and opened in summer to a small courtyard where his wife grew medicinal herbs in clay pots, some for his practice, some simply because she found their smell pleasing in the morning. She had strong opinions about the correct proportion of cardamom in butter tea and would argue this point with complete seriousness while laughing at herself for arguing it. He had thought on more mornings than he could count, precisely the person he would have designed if designing were possible, which of course it is not, which of course is part of what makes love both precious and terrifying. The epidemic arrived in the autumn of 1103. It came across the passes from the east, the way things often came across the passes invisibly, without announcement, in the bodies of travelers. The first cases appeared in the lower village, then spread to the farms along the river, then into the valley itself. It moved with the efficiency of something that has no malice and no mercy, simply the blind persistence of a natural process, doing what natural processes do. Sonam Rinchen worked without ceasing. He mixed medicines by lamplight and carried them through the early morning dark to households where families lay in the particular silence of the badly ill. He had his methods, refined through years of study and practice, and he applied them with everything he had. His daughter died in the second week of October, at the age of 4. His son died 12 days later. He continued working. He did not know how not to, moving through the valley with his medicine bag, treating the sick, doing whatever could be done. He did not stop to process what had happened, because stopping would have required a stillness he was not capable of yet, and because the sick needed tending, and because as long as he was moving, he was still a physician and not a father in ruins. His wife fell ill in November. He treated her the way he had treated every patient, with complete knowledge, complete attention, complete application of every tool available to him. He prepared the medicines himself, checking and rechecking the proportions. He sat at her bedside through nights, during which the only sound was her breathing and the wind in the shutters and the butter lamp consuming itself quietly on the low table between them. He had saved many lives. He believed in what he knew. He applied what he knew with the precision of someone who has spent years learning to trust precision, and he watched it fail. On a night in early December, when the snow outside was blue-white under a half moon and the valley was completely silent, his wife called him close and told him to sit beside her. He sat. She had been a woman of considerable directness, even now, and she used what clarity remained to her. She told him that she understood what was coming and that she was not afraid of it in the way he might expect her to be. She told him that what frightened her was not her own passing, but his, not his death, but what she feared grief might do to the particular quality of the man she loved, which was an openness she had noticed from the beginning and which she believed the world needed more of than it currently had. She said, "I want you to make me a promise." He said, "Tell me." She said, "When I am gone, Do not marry again. Become a monk. Give what you have not to one household, but to everyone. You have knowledge and tenderness, both. That combination is too rare to spend on only one life. He looked at her. Outside, the snow held its silence. The lamp burned. He said, "I promise." She died before the new year. He was 25 years old. He had buried 2 children and a wife in the space of 3 months. He had all his medical knowledge intact, all his training, all the careful accumulation of years of study, and not a single piece of it had been sufficient. He sat in the stone house, which still smelled of the herbs she had grown in the courtyard, and experienced what happens when the ground on which a person has built their entire understanding of themselves simply ceases to exist. He did not cry in the dramatic way of stories. The grief came differently as a sustained blankness, a quality of the world having become suddenly much smaller in all directions. The courtyard herb pots were still there. The butter lamp was still there. His medicine bag leaned against the wall where he had always left it, and it was exactly as it had been. And it was completely different. The way a coat belonging to someone who has died becomes different without the body to give it shape. He kept his promise. In the spring, he arranged for the passing of his household, gave his medical equipment to a colleague, and took novice vows at a monastery. The abbot who received him noted that the young man from Dakpo seemed to arrive at the gates of monastic life not as someone seeking refuge, but as someone who had already survived the worst that could happen and was now free, in a way that comfort could never have provided, to go anywhere. The years that followed were years of study. He moved from teacher to teacher, absorbing the Kadampa teachings of Atisha's lineage with the same methodical thoroughness he had brought to medicine. He was a good student, attentive, rigorous, willing to challenge his own understanding and then sit with the discomfort of not having it resolved. His teachers appreciated him. He appreciated his teachers. And yet something in him knew the way the body knows certain things before the mind can articulate them, that he had not yet found the source of what he was looking for. Then, on an ordinary afternoon, 7 years after his wife's death, he overheard a conversation in a village between 2 wandering practitioners discussing a yogi who lived in a cave somewhere in the mountains, an unconventional teacher, neither monk nor scholar in the conventional sense, who had reportedly turned cotton rags into warmth and nettles into sustenance, and the entire substance of his suffering into the material of liberation. Something moved in Sonam Rinpoche's chest, in exactly the place where the grief had lived for 7 years. He asked for the direction and began walking the following morning. The journey to find the yogi was long and difficult, through passes and valleys that offered nothing soft about themselves. He arrived ill from the exertion, feverish, barely able to stand. A village at the base of the mountain where the yogi lived took him in, fed him, and told him with reverent certainty that the yogi had been expecting him. He had been expecting him. He had told the villagers someone was coming, a monk from U, a great bodhisattva, someone in whose service hospitality would generate immense good fortune. When Sonam Rinchen heard this, a flicker of pride moved through him. He was aware of it. He noted it. He thought, briefly, that perhaps he was indeed a significant person. The yogi, upon being informed of this reaction by some communication that neither required words nor explanation, did not see him for 15 days. Sonam Rinchen waited at the edge of the mountain, practicing, studying, tending to the village sick, which was a thing he could not stop doing regardless of the circumstances. At the end of 15 days, he was allowed to climb. He found the yogi sitting in his cave, cross-legged, entirely at ease with being a person who lived in a cave with no furniture and subsisted largely on nettles. His skin, from the nettles and the altitude and whatever else had happened in those mountain years, had turned a remarkable shade of greenish-grey. He was looking at Sonam Rinchen with an expression of complete attention and a barely visible amusement. Between them on the stone floor was a skull cup filled with Chang Tibetan barley beer. "Drink," the yogi said. Sonam Rinchen looked at the skull cup. He had been a monk for 7 years. He had taken vows. He had studied the Vinaya, the monastic code, with careful attention. The code was explicit about alcohol. His teachers had been explicit about the code. He had, over 7 years, constructed around himself the careful architecture of a man who kept his vows. And this architecture had served him, had given structure to the years after his wife's death, had provided a kind of container for the grief and the transformation both. He looked at the skull cup. He looked at the yogi. He thought, for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last, about what his wife had said to him at the end. "Give what you have not to one household but to everyone. You have knowledge and tenderness both. That combination is too rare to spend on only one life." He picked up the skull cup and drank it completely. The yogi received him as a son. What followed the teachings, the years of practice, the eventual founding of Dakla Gampo Monastery in 1121, the writing of what would become one of the most important texts in all of Tibetan Buddhism, the hundreds of students who came to study with the physician from Dakpo who had become something no single word could quite contain. All of that is the story that history tells. But beneath that story, supporting it like the stone beneath the monastery floors, is a simpler one. A man loved someone completely. He lost her. He lost his children. He lost the ground of his understanding of himself. And in the ruins of everything he had trusted, he found not immediately, not without years of patience sitting with the loss that what grief had taken from him was precisely what had needed to be released in order for something deeper to emerge. Not that the loss was good. Not that it happened for a reason. Not that everything works out. The loss was real, and the grief was real, and the stone house with the herb pots in the courtyard was real. And all of it happened. And none of it could be undone. But the man who sat with the yogi in the cave, holding a skull cup he should not have been holding, drinking without hesitation because something in him had become large enough to hold the vows and the grief and the love and the loss all at once that man had been built, patiently and without consent, by exactly what had happened to him. This is one of the oldest things that these traditions know about grief, repeated across centuries and traditions, and the specific, unrepeatable losses of individual lives, that grief is not empty, that grief contains everything that was loved, and that what was loved, when it is fully felt, fully honored, fully carried, rather than escaped or suppressed or arranged into something more manageable, becomes, in time, the very substance from which a larger life is made. Not the grief resolved, the person expanded, the stone house held in memory, and the herb pots, and the voice discussing cardamom, and all of it present somewhere in the physician who became a master, in the master whose words are still offered across 9 centuries to people lying awake in the dark. Like you, perhaps tonight. Let that settle beneath your thinking, beneath the level of agreement or disagreement, into the body itself. Feel the places in you that have loved something and lost it. Not to examine them or solve them, just to acknowledge they are here. They are real. And the person who carries them is large enough, has always been large enough, even when it didn't feel that way. And as you feel that, let your breath arrive softly, without effort. Feel your hands, heavy and still. Your jaw unclenched just slightly more than before. The particular warmth of the blanket across your legs. If you drift now, that is right. If sleep finds you here, between this story and the next, let it. You don't need to stay awake to receive what these stories carry. The body knows how to absorb what the mind has heard. Trust that. And if you are still with me, still here, still awake in the quiet, then know that what comes next will take us forward in the arc of tonight. Not deeper into grief, but gently, carefully, toward the first signs of what grief can become when it is not fought. We travel next to the mountains of Korea, in the latter part of the 19th century, to a monastery where a young monk named Gyeongheo was sitting with a grief not for one person, but for an entire tradition, and where a single, unexpected encounter on a dusty road was about to shatter every certainty he had ever built, and leave in its place something that could never be taken. Let your eyes close if they will. Let the breath continue without your supervision. Let the next story find you wherever you have drifted. Both are welcome. All of this is welcome. You are welcome here, exactly as you are tonight. In the autumn of 1879, in the Chungcheong province of Korea, a monk named Gyeongheo was walking the road between two monasteries and did not yet know that he was about to have his entire understanding of himself removed. He was 30 years old. He had been ordained at the age of 9, entering the Sangha as a young novice at Cheonjanggam Monastery, nestled in the layered mountains of central Korea, where the ridges unfolded one behind the other in the autumn haze like the pages of a book that had been wet and dried and slightly warped, each ridge distinct, each one receding into a slightly cooler blue than the one before it. The whole landscape arranged in a depth that suggested more world than any single person could hold. He had grown up inside the monastery in the way that children who enter religious life early grow up shaped by its rhythms before he had the capacity to choose them. The pre-dawn bells and the long sitting periods and the quality of silence in a hall full of practitioners becoming the texture of his inner life before any other texture had the chance to establish itself. He had been, by any measure his tradition offered for such assessments, an exceptional monk. He had memorized the sutras with a facility that astonished his senior teachers, not merely the words themselves, which any diligent student could master given enough time, but the architecture beneath the words, the way each teaching rested on and illuminated the ones around it. The full dimensionality of the doctrinal structure that generations of Korean Buddhist scholarship had constructed over centuries. He had given formal lectures on Hwayom philosophy and Seon practice at Donghaksa Monastery that drew practitioners from other temples, sometimes from other provinces, to sit in the teaching hall and listen. His ability to take a difficult concept into dependence, the nature of mind, the relationship between sudden enlightenment and gradual cultivation that had occupied Korean Buddhist scholars since Jinul, and render it in language that was precise without being cold, intellectually rigorous, without losing the warmth that made people feel the teaching rather than merely receive it. This was His teachers had told him, in the private conversations that teachers have with students they consider genuinely promising, a gift that appeared rarely and should be treated accordingly. He was, in other words, a person who had built something very solid and very specific from the materials that his tradition had provided, a self-understanding grounded in knowledge, in competence, in the reliable correspondence between careful study and genuine mastery. He knew the texts. He knew the doctrines. He knew the correct forms of practice, the precise requirements of monastic conduct. The history of the Korean Seon lineage, from its transmission through the Tang dynasty masters, down through Jinul and the great figures of the Goryeo period, to the reduced and suppressed but still surviving tradition that he had entered as a child. And somewhere beneath all of this, knowing so familiar to him that he had stopped noticing it the way one stops noticing the walls of a room one has always lived in, was an assumption that had never been examined. That understanding Buddhism and living it were, for him, approximately the same thing. That a man who could explain impermanence with genuine clarity had, in that explaining, met impermanence. That the map was, if not the territory, at least sufficient preparation for it. He had set out that autumn morning carrying a cloth bag with some documents from his abbot, taking the route through the foothills that passed several villages before climbing back into the mountain range where the receiving monastery sat. The morning was clear and cool, the maples in the lower slopes beginning to turn, the path through the valley dry and firm underfoot. He had walked this route before. He expected to arrive before evening. He expected, as people expect on ordinary days, nothing in particular. The first sign was the smell. He noticed it before he had rounded the last bend in the path before the first village, a smell that was wrong in the way the nose knows before the mind can name what it knows. Not the ordinary smell of wood smoke and rice cooking and the turned earth of autumn fields being prepared for winter crops. Something beneath those smells, or threaded through them, carrying information that the body receives not as thought, but as a kind of held breath. A heaviness in the air, a quality of things having stopped. He came around the bend and stopped walking. The village was visually intact. The thatched roofs were in place. The low stone walls between the properties stood as they had always stood. The persimmon trees at the settlement's edge held their bright orange fruit against the blue sky, with the complete indifference of persimmon trees to whatever is happening beneath them. Everything that should have been there was there. The sound was wrong. Not the silence of a working village in the early afternoon, the particular absence of noise that means people are occupied in their fields and their houses and their lives. The children at their lessons. The old men in the spots where old men sit. This was a different silence. The silence of things having ceased rather than things continuing elsewhere. The silence of a place where the ordinary business of human occupation had stopped, not paused. A dog lay at the edge of the path in a posture that from 15 paces looked like sleep and from 5 did not. Gyeongheo stood for a moment at the entrance to the village. The rational part of his mind was assembling the available information, the smell, the silence, the dog, the quality of the light on surfaces that should have had people moving across them. The rest of him, the part that exists below assembly and assessment, had already arrived at the conclusion and was simply waiting for the rest to catch up. Cholera had moved through Korea that year, coming across the passes from the east and spreading through valleys with the indifferent thoroughness of a natural process that has no awareness of what it is doing and therefore no possibility of mercy or of malice. It had reached the southern provinces in the summer and moved north through the autumn. This village, in a valley slightly off the main routes, had received no warning that would have helped and no help that could have arrived in time. Gyeongheo would learn later, from the monks at the receiving monastery who had heard from a traveling merchant, that the illness had reached this particular settlement 3 days before his arrival. He walked into the village. He did this not from bravery, or from the dispassion that a highly trained practitioner is sometimes credited with in stories about practitioners encountering difficult situations. He walked in because his legs moved forward before his fear had fully organized itself into an instruction to stop, and because something in him, something deeper than the monk who gave lectures and memorized sutras, recognized that what was here required to be witnessed. He moved slowly through the lanes between the houses. He looked through open doorways. He stood in the central clearing of the settlement, where the village well stood with its wooden cover and its rope and its bucket. Everything correct and in its place. He observed, without counting and without systematizing, what was present. What was present was the concrete, irreducible, unglamorous fact of human mortality, not as a doctrinal proposition, not as one of the 3 marks of existence that he could and had, many times, explain with genuine clarity and appropriate illustration to rooms full of ordained monks, not as anicca, the Pali word for impermanence, which he could write correctly in 3 scripts and define precisely in 5 different contexts and trace through the entire arc of the Buddha's teaching, from the first sermon at Deer Park to the final instructions before parinirvana. What was present was a bowl of half-finished rice on a low table inside an open doorway, with a pair of chopsticks resting across the rim at an angle that meant they had been set down briefly, with the intention of being picked up again. What was present was a child's sandal at the edge of a path between 2 houses. What was present was the persimmon trees and the blue sky and the autumn light falling on everything with complete impartiality, on the living and on what was no longer living, on the bowl of rice and the wooden well cover and the dog at the edge of the path, all of it receiving the same light, none of it more or less illuminated than any other. Gyeongheo stood in the center of the village for a long time. He could not have told you afterward how long. Long enough for the light to shift perceptibly. Long enough for a crow to arrive in one of the persimmon trees and depart again without him noticing either arrival or departure. He thought about the lectures he had given. He thought about the care with which he had prepared them, the selection of the right texts, the arrangement of the arguments, the particular examples chosen to make the abstract concrete for his listeners. He thought about the sessions in which he had explained impermanence to monks who had traveled hours to hear him, the rice plant and the season, the flame and the oil, the breath and its ending, the way all composite things are by their nature subject to dissolution, and how understanding this is not cause for despair but for liberation. He had said these things. He had believed them, in the sense that a person believes the things they say when they are speaking from genuine conviction rather than from performance. He had meant every word. And standing in that village in the autumn of 1879, surrounded by the absolute and specific evidence of everything he had been saying, he discovered something about the difference between knowing a thing in the mouth and knowing it in the bone. The doctrine was correct. He had not been wrong. Impermanence was exactly what he had described it to be, and every illustration he had offered was true. And the lineage of teachers through whom he had received these teachings had transmitted them with integrity across the centuries. But the truth had been living in his articulation of it. And articulation is not the same as the territory that the articulation describes. He sat down in the dust of the village path, not as a considered practice, not as a meditation technique. He sat down because standing was no longer what his body wanted to do, and the ground was there, And it seemed, in that moment, to be the correct response to the situation, to reduce his height, to bring himself closer to the earth, to stop being a monk on his way somewhere and simply be a person in a village in the autumn. With the light going sideways through the persimmon trees and the silence everywhere and the chopsticks resting at an angle across the bowl, he had explained impermanence many hundreds of times. He had not, until this afternoon, sat with it in the dust. He sat for a long time. He did not cry, which surprised him slightly. He did not feel the dramatic internal upheaval that stories about transformative moments often describe. What he felt was quieter than that and more disturbing than that, a quality of the ground shifting beneath everything he had built, not in a sudden collapse, but in the slow, certain way of something fundamental, revealing that it had been assumed rather than tested. This is a grief with no name on it. Not the loss of a person, though that grief is real and was present in that village in every doorway and every path. A different grief, the grief of a man discovering that the understanding he had spent decades constructing is not, as he had believed, the same thing as the understanding it describes. That having a sophisticated map of difficult terrain is not the same as having walked it. That being an expert in the language of loss is not the same as having sat in the dust of it, with the chopsticks at the angle they were at, with the light the way it was, with nowhere to go. He got up eventually. He continued to the receiving monastery. He delivered the documents. He ate the meal that was offered. He observed the evening practice. He slept, he would say later that he was not sure sleep was quite the right word for what happened when he lay down that night. But the body did something, some necessary process, and the morning came. He returned to Chonjanggam in the following days and went to his abbot. "I cannot continue lecturing," he said. The abbot was a man of 63 years who had practiced long enough to know that this sentence, when spoken by a monk like Gyeongheo, with that particular quality of flatness in the voice, was not a complaint or a request, but a report. "Why not?" he said. "Because I don't know enough," Gyeongheo said. The abbot looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not surprise. "Good," he said, which was not what Gyeongheo had expected. "That is the most promising thing you have said in 20 years. What followed was not a sudden transformation. The tradition does not work through sudden transformations, despite what the encounter dialogue literature sometimes suggests. What followed was months of Hwadu practice, the method unique to Korean Seon, in which a single question is held continuously in the mind, not to be answered, but to be inhabited with complete sincerity. The question Gyeongheo received, the question about the nature of the awareness that is aware, held without the comfort of conceptual resolution, returned to each time the mind tried to settle into something familiar. This question did not make things easier. It made things more genuinely difficult in the way that honest difficulty is different from performed difficulty. It removed, one by one, the remaining places where understanding had been substituting for presence. He broke open, as the Korean masters call it, in the winter of that year, the awakening. When it came, was not experienced as the arrival of something new. It was experienced as the recognition of something that had always been there beneath the lectures, beneath the knowledge, beneath the assumptions, beneath the grief of the village, and the dust and the chopsticks and the light on the persimmon trees. A vast, unchanged, unchosen awareness that had been present through every experience, requiring nothing from any of them in order to remain exactly what it was. In the years that followed, Gyeongheo became what Korean Buddhist history remembers him as, the reviver of the Seon lineage at its most critical moment. The teacher, whose students became the teachers who carried the tradition forward. He established meditation halls at Sudiak Temple in South Chungcheong Province, at Gyeongheo Monastery in Busan, at Haein Monastery in South Gyeongsang, at Songwang and Wyom in the Cheolla provinces. He trained 4 principal disciples whose own lineages sustained Korean Seon through the following century. He became, according to the Jogye order's own historical assessment, the 75th patriarch of Korean Seon, the man who restored the direct meditation transmission that had nearly been lost. All of that is what he built after the village. What matters tonight is what happened in the village. What happened when a man of genuine knowledge and genuine practice walked into a space where knowledge was no longer sufficient and practice could no longer be performed, and something had to be genuinely faced rather than expertly described. This is the pattern that grief reveals. When we allow it to reveal, rather than running from it, or explaining it, or arranging it into something more manageable, we build ourselves, all of us, on assumptions we have stopped noticing. That what we understand is what we know. That the structures we have made from our experience will hold against the weight of further experience. That we are, more or less, the person we have been presenting as to others, to ourselves, in the interior life that no one witnesses. We build these structures carefully and maintain them with the specific vigilance of people who have learned that structure keeps things orderly. And we are, in our most honest moments, dimly aware that they are structures rather than ground. And then something arrives, a loss, an absence, an autumn afternoon in a village that has gone completely silent, that reveals the difference. In that revelation, there is a choice that is not really a choice. We can insist on the map. We can return to the monastery and continue lecturing and refuse to let what we have seen change the way we hold what we know. Many people do this. The map took years to make and the territory is uncomfortable. Or we can sit down in the dust. We can let the certainty soften. We can let the knowledge that was comfortable stop being comfortable. We can hold the question that has no answer, the mind can reach and discover, slowly, through the patient months of sitting with it, that beneath the question and beneath the knowledge and beneath the grief that arrived when both became insufficient, there is something that was never made and cannot be unmade. Something that was present in the village and present in the lecture hall and present in the dust and present right now, in this quiet hour, exactly as it has always been. Notice that now, if you are willing, not as a thought, as a quality of the space around you. Something in you is awake and aware and unchanged by everything that tonight has brought or everything that any day has brought. It does not analyze the grief. It holds it. It does not explain the loss. It contains it. It has been here for every moment of your life, watching, present, requiring nothing from the moment in order to remain. Let your breath be quiet. Let your hands be still. Feel the weight of your body on the bed, specific and real, and notice that the one who feels that weight is larger than it, has always been larger, even in the hardest hours. And as that recognition settles not as certainty, just as a quiet possibility, a softening, let the next story arrive. We travel south now, across the water, to the mountains of Vietnam in the year 1299, to a king who had won 2 wars and built a nation and loved his people with the full force of everything he had, and who walked away from all of it on an autumn morning to climb a mountain alone, carrying in his hands a grief that was not sorrow but something rarer and harder to name, the particular weight of a life that has fulfilled every obligation asked of it, and now stands at the edge of what fulfillment cannot reach. Let your eyes close if they wish. Let sleep be welcome whenever it comes. And let the next story find you wherever you have drifted awake or between, or somewhere quietly dissolving into rest. All of it is right. All of it is welcome here. In the autumn of the year that Vietnamese calendars marked as the 19th year of the Hung Long reign, which the Western calendar would record as 1299, a man left the palace at Thung Long before the court, had risen and walked north through the pre-dawn dark toward the mountain that had been calling him since childhood. He was 41 years old. He traveled with a small attendant and a hemp robe folded into a cloth bundle under his arm. And he did not take the royal palanquin. And he did not announce his departure with the protocols that had governed every public movement of his life for the past 2 decades. The palace gates opened because the gatekeepers recognized him, not because the ceremonial drums had sounded. The road north was quiet in the hour before dawn. The rice paddies on either side of the dike path holding the darkness in their flooded surfaces. The stars reflected there in irregular patterns that shifted when the wind crossed the water. His name was Chun Khum. He had been born in the 12th month of the year of the horse, in the palace of Thung Long, as the eldest son of the emperor, which meant that the question of what his life would be had been answered before he had the capacity to ask it. He had been named Crown Prince at 16. He had been crowned emperor at 21. With the full ceremonial weight of a dynasty's expectations transferred onto his shoulders in a ritual that lasted 3 days, and that he had endured with the composure that had already, by that age, become his most legible quality to the court around him. He had governed Dai Viet for 14 years. In those 14 years, the Mongol armies of Kublai Khan had come twice across the northern passes to break his country and been turned back twice, once in 1285, once in 1288. The second time in the decisive naval battle at Bac Dung River, where the iron-tipped stakes his generals had driven into the riverbed at low tide destroyed the Yuan fleet with a thoroughness that altered the strategic calculations of the largest empire in the world. He had sat in council through the nights before those battles. He had made the decisions that the generals required of him. He had watched men die for choices he had made. And he had carried that weight the way kings carry such weights, publicly composed, privately unreduced. After the second victory, he had abdicated the throne to his son in 1293. Becoming Tai Thượng Hoàng, the retired emperor, the figure above the throne who is officially withdrawn from governance and who continues, in practice, to be consulted on everything that matters. He had spent 6 years in this position, attending to the transition of power, managing diplomatic relationships with the Yuan court that had, after 2 military failures, become willing to engage through other means, conducting himself in the interstitial role that his family and his country required of him. 6 years of being officially retired while remaining entirely present. 6 years of holding power with open hands while everyone in the court watched to see if the hands would close. 6 years of the mountain waiting. He had wanted to go to Yen too since he was a boy. His father had taken him there as a child, climbing the forested ridges to the monasteries that clung to the slopes of the sacred mountain in Quang Ninh province, the series of pagodas ascending from the valley floor to the cloud-wrapped peak at over 1,000 meters. each one marking a stage in the ascent toward the summit, where the mist moved through the old-growth trees with the patience of something that has been moving through them for a very long time. He had wanted, even as a boy of 8 or 9, standing in the incense smoke of the upper monasteries, to keep climbing, to not come back down. But he had been a crown prince, and crown princes come back down. He had made the formal vows quietly, without announcement. In 1295, receiving ordination as a Buddhist monk while still performing the functions of the retired emperor. He had lived for years in the productive discomfort of a man who was officially two things at once: the secular power that the kingdom needed and the renunciant that his own deepest nature had always been. He had managed this dissonance with the same composure he brought to everything, which was not a pretense, but a discipline, a daily practice of serving what the moment required, regardless of what the practitioner inside him was asking for. And now, in the autumn of 1299, 6 years after the abdication, with his son's reign stable and the diplomatic situation with the Yuan resolved and the harvests good and the country in as close to a condition of genuine peace as any country ever arrives at. Now, the reasons not to climb had finally run out. He had built a small hermitage on the upper slope of Yentu the previous July. In the 7th month, a simple structure of timber and thatch that he had named Nu Duak, the Royal Herb Hermitage, because the naming was one last gesture toward the world he was leaving, a way of signing a document before putting down the pen. By August, he had completed the arrangements. He had said what needed to be said to his son. He had settled what could be settled. He had looked at the life he had lived in its entirety, the childhood in the palace, the crown that arrived before he had chosen it, the wars and the decisions and the councils and the diplomatic meals and the 14 years of being the person between his people and everything that threatened them, and he had bowed to it in the specific way that one bows to something that is genuinely finished. Then he had walked out of the gate before the court rose. The mountain received him the way mountains receive everything, without comment, without ceremony, with the complete indifference of something that has been here long before any human arrived to have an opinion about it. The path up from Hoa Yen Pagoda was steep and rooted. The old stones between the tree roots worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet. He climbed slowly. The attendant followed at a distance that gave him the solitude he needed while maintaining the form of not being entirely alone, which was the compromise that his position still required. The forest on Yentu in the autumn of 1299 was layered in the way that old-growth forests in the mountains of northern Vietnam are, layered the canopy overhead, forming a second sky of interlocked branches, the understory of shade-tolerant trees and bamboo and fern, creating a world of filtered green light. The forest floor soft, with decades of fallen leaves now composting into the dark. Fragrant soil, from which the next generation of trees was already growing in the patient, unhurried way of things that have no deadline. Birds moved in the middle distance. Water ran somewhere below the path, audible but not visible. He stopped at a point above the second pagoda, where the path curved around a large stone outcropping, and the view opened briefly to the east, the valleys below, the silver threads of the rivers, the rice fields in their autumn ochre, and beyond them, the haze where the land met the sky over the coast. From here, on a clear day, you could theoretically see the sea. Today, the haze was too thick. He stood at the overlook for a long moment, not looking at what could be seen, but at the quality of looking itself, the way the mind, released from the necessity of response, could simply rest in the act of perceiving. Below, somewhere in those valleys, his country continued. His son sat on the throne that he had occupied. The court conducted its business. The farmers tended their rice. The merchants moved along the rivers. The monks in the valley pagodas chanted their morning sutras. All of it continuing, as it had always continued, as it would continue without him, or more precisely, without the version of him that had been required to manage it. He stood at the overlook for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Then he turned and climbed higher. This is what grief looks like when the loss is not of a person, but of a self. When what is being released is not something taken away by force or by illness or by the ordinary cruelties of impermanence, but something offered up voluntarily, with full understanding of what is being released, because the offering has finally become more important than the holding. He grieved the king, not with tears, or not only with tears. The tradition does not record the specific quality of his inner experience on that ascent, and it would be presumptuous to invent it too precisely. But the grief was real. The life he had lived in those palace rooms, in those council chambers, in those night-long vigils before battle, it had been his life. It had contained genuine love for his people, for his son, for the particular texture of the world that a king inhabits when he takes seriously the obligation to protect it. The renunciation was not a rejection of that love. It was the completion of it. It was the act of a man who had loved something fully enough to recognize when holding it further would diminish rather than honor what it had been. He arrived at the hermitage before midday. He sat in the doorway for a time, looking out at the mist that was beginning to come in from the east. Moving through the upper canopy of the mountain forest, the way mist always moves unhurriedly, following the contours of the terrain, filling the low spaces first and then rising. He took off his traveling shoes. He folded the documents he had brought, the final formal correspondence of the retired emperor, into the cloth bundle and set them in the corner of the single room. He arranged the hemp robe. He sat, not performing sitting, not conducting the meditation of a former emperor of Viet who was now, formally and finally, beginning his life as a monk. Simply sitting, the old practice, the one he had been doing since his father first brought him to these mountains as a boy, the one that had persisted through the coronation and the wars and the long years of official semi-retirement. The practice that had always been there beneath the performing of everything else. The mist came in fully by the early afternoon. The mountain disappeared into it. The valley below disappeared. The sound of the birds changed as the visibility changed, becoming quieter, more interior, as though the mist had softened the boundary between the acoustic world and the listening one. He breathed. In the years that followed, the 9 years of practice at Yen Tur before his death in 1308, Trần Nhân Tông became the founding patriarch of the Trúc Lâm school, the only fully indigenous Buddhist tradition that Vietnam produced, rooted in Vietnamese soil and Vietnamese sensibility, shaped by the particular history of a people who had held their own identity against extraordinary pressure and found, in doing so, a kind of Buddhism that was both deeply traditional and completely native. He traveled through the country, teaching not only monks but ordinary people, farmers and soldiers, and women who had never entered a monastery, bringing the Zen teaching into the texture of ordinary life in the way that his tradition's name always implied it should go, into the bamboo grove, into the daily world, rooted and growing wherever there is ground. He died on the mountain he had finally climbed, in the 11th month of 1308, at the Ngoa Van Pagoda, near the summit of Yen Tu. According to the tradition's records, he called a young novice named Bao Sat to his bedside, gave his final instructions, and then sat in meditation posture and passed away as the night deepened into the hours before dawn. The novice who was with him wrote afterward that his face was completely at rest, that there was no tension in it, no residue of the years of difficulty and decision, only the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they recognized. But the arrival began on the path up the mountain that autumn morning of 1299. It began when he turned away from the overlook and climbed toward the mist rather than descending toward the valleys. This is the teaching that his life carries for grief, for loss, for the question of what remains when what we have been holding is finally released. We are, most of us, carrying versions of the crown, not the physical object, the actual weight of political power that Trần Nhân Tông set down, but its equivalents in our own lives. The role we have been performing for so long, we have stopped noticing it is a performance. The identity we built from the materials of what was expected of us, rather than from the materials of what we actually are. The sense of obligation to a relationship, to a version of ourselves that others recognize, to the life we have been living rather than the life that has been asking to be lived, that keeps us in the valley when the mountain is calling. Grief, in this understanding, is often the messenger that arrives to tell us that a particular version of ourselves has been completed. Not that it was wrong, not that the love it contained was false, but that it has run its full course, done what it was here to do, and is now ready to be set down so that something deeper can climb. The resistant mind says, "But I am not ready to set it down. I am not ready to let go of who I have been." The tradition answers, from across 7 centuries and from the mist of Yentu mountain, readiness is not the condition for the climbing. The climbing is the condition. You begin, and readiness follows. Or it doesn't, and you climb anyway, because the mountain is there and you have finally run out of reasons to wait. Feel that tonight, in whatever form it arrives. Whatever you have been holding, whatever version of a necessary self, whatever obligation that has outlasted its usefulness, whatever grief that is, also a form of faithfulness to something that has ended, you are not required to resolve it tonight. You are not required to set it down completely. You are only invited to feel, for a moment, the possibility that beneath what you are carrying, there is a ground that does not need to be earned, a mountain that is already there, a path that has been waiting. Let your breath arrive slowly. Let it leave slowly. Feel the weight of your body, that specific, unrepeatable weight resting on the surface that is holding it. You don't have to hold yourself up right now. You are being held. The ground is here. The bed is here. The night is here, patient as a mountain. Let your shoulders release. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands be open, resting, nothing to grip. If sleep comes now, let it come. You don't need to stay for what follows. The stories will continue without your active attention, and something in you, something older than attention, will receive them. And if you are still here, still in this quiet, still awake in the way that late-night wakefulness has its own quality, suspended between the day and whatever the night will bring, then know that what comes next moves us into the heart of tonight's descent. We travel to Tibet, to the 11th century, to a mountain valley in the region of Gyeongheo, near the Nepalese border, where a man named Milarepa, who would become, in time, the greatest yogi his tradition has ever produced, returned to his village after years of absence and walked through the door of his childhood home and found, in the ruins and the dust and the silence of what remained, the specific grief that would break him open completely. His name in full legend is Milarepa. His mother's bones were waiting for him in a heap of rags on the floor of the ruined house. And what happened in him in the moment he understood what he was holding, that is what we go to next. Let your eyes close now. If they will, let the breath continue without your supervision. Let whatever is releasing in you tonight release, at whatever pace it chooses, without being asked to hurry. In the western region of Tibet, called Gyeongheo, near the border with Nepal, where the high plateau breaks into a series of descending valleys that become, eventually, the foothills and then the lower world below the snow line. There is a particular quality of light in the late afternoon that travelers to that region have described across centuries in nearly identical terms, a light that is not warm and not cold, but something between the two, clarifying rather than softening, that makes the surfaces of stone and earth and the spare vegetation of the high altitude visible with a precision that lower altitudes, with their thicker air and richer moisture, do not offer. In this light, things appear as they are. Shadows are exact. Distance are legible. There is nowhere for anything to hide. It was in this light, in the latter part of the 11th century, that a man named Milarepa came down from the mountain where he had been practicing and walked the last hours of a journey he had been both dreading and unable to postpone any longer toward the valley where he had been born. He was perhaps in his middle 30s by then, though the years of cave practice and nettle soup and the particular rigors of what his teacher Marpa had transmitted to him, the Tummo practices that generated inner heat, the Mahamudra teachings that pointed directly at the nature of mind, had done something to his body that made age difficult to read in him. His skin had taken on a greenish tint from the nettles that had been his primary sustenance for long periods. He was thin in the way of people who have stopped thinking about food as comfort and now receive it only as fuel. And he walked with the slightly forward lean of someone whose attention is habitually directed inward. He had left Marpa's home in Lodrag after years of the most demanding apprenticeship. The tradition records the years of building towers with his bare hands and tearing them down again on Marpa's instruction. The years of being refused teaching while he watched other students receive it. The years of physical and emotional difficulty that his teacher had deliberately constructed for reasons that Milarepa would spend the rest of his life understanding more fully. He had received the complete transmission of the Kagyu teachings, the Mahamudra, the 6 yogas of Naropa, the practices that Marpa had carried back from India through 2 journeys of extraordinary difficulty. He had gone to retreat in mountain caves and practiced with the intensity of a man who understands, at a level below strategy and calculation, that there is no time and that all available energy should go toward the one thing. He had made progress, real progress, the kind that the tradition recognizes not through the practitioner's self-assessment, but through the quality of what emerges in the meeting between awareness and its objects. His teacher had confirmed it. His own experience confirmed it, in the specific way that genuine experience confirms things. Without the false certainty of the ego claiming territory it has not actually visited. And yet, there was a dream. He had it during a period of retreat at one of Marpa's mountain hermitages. In the months before Marpa finally told him his training was complete and it was time to go. In the dream, he returned to his village. In the dream, the house was in ruins. In the dream, his mother was not there. He woke from the dream with the knowledge that was not interpretation but simple, direct knowing, the kind that arrives through the body before the mind has arranged it into narrative. His mother was dead. The village he had left was not the village he would return to. What he would find when he arrived was not homecoming but completion, the final installment of a loss that had been accumulating since the morning. 25 years before. When his father died and everything his family had owned passed into the hands of people who used it as a weapon against the ones it should have protected, he had told his teacher. Marpa had listened and had wept. The tradition records this. The great teacher weeping at the news, which is one of the details that makes the story trustworthy, and had said, Go and look. What you find there will teach you what I cannot. He walked for weeks through the high passes and the descending valleys, through weather that the plateau offered without consulting his preferences, through landscapes that shifted from the austere grandeur of high altitude to the slightly more forgiving terrain of the lower valleys. He arrived at his home region in the late afternoon of a day whose light was doing exactly what the light in Gungtang does, clarifying everything, leaving nothing obscured. He found the house, or what remained of it. The walls still stood. More or less, the thick stone construction of Tibetan buildings resists complete collapse the way the people who build them resist it. Stubbornly, and over a long time, but the roof had fallen in sections. The wooden beams decayed and sagged, and the interior, when he pushed open the door that hung half off its leather hinges, held the particular atmosphere of a space that has been empty long enough for the emptiness to establish itself as a permanent resident. The smell of the place reached him before his eyes had adjusted to the interior dimness. Old dust, old stone, the specific dry smell of a space that has held neither fire nor breath for a long time. He stepped over the threshold. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes find what was there. The low table where the family had eaten was still present, collapsed on one side, its wooden surface bleached and cracked. The clay cooking vessel near the former hearth, a folded cloth in the corner that had been there long enough to have become part of the floor's composition. The remains of what had been stored on the high shelf along the east wall, identifiable now only as shapes. And on the floor, in the area where his mother had slept, a pile of rags caked with dust, over which weeds had grown through the gaps in the fallen roof, pushing up through the fabric and the debris with the patient insistence of things that know how to grow in difficult conditions. He crossed the room. He knelt. He gathered the rags in his hands, and as he gathered them, the rags shifted, and a number of human bones, bleached white, slipped out from the fabric and lay in the dust in the clarifying afternoon light. He knew them immediately. He did not need to reason his way to the knowledge. He looked at what was in his hands and in the dust of the floor of his mother's room, and he knew, the way you know the face of someone you have loved for your entire life, regardless of what time has done to it. He was so overcome with grief that he could not stand. The tradition's account of this moment is direct and without embellishment, and it is worth sitting with in its simplicity. He could not think. He could not speak. An overwhelming sense of longing and sadness swept over him that had no bottom to it, no place where it ended and something else began. He had practiced for years. He had sat in cave darkness through winters of profound cold. He had moved through practices that deliberately destabilized everything the mind uses to construct a comfortable relationship with its own existence. He had, by any reasonable measure, developed a relationship with impermanence that was not merely conceptual, and none of it, in this moment, made the slightest difference to the grief. He held his mother's bones in the afternoon light of a ruined house in Gyeongheo, and he simply wept. This is the first thing the tradition wants us to know about this story, that he wept. That the practitioner who would become the greatest yogi in Tibetan Buddhist history, whose songs of realization are still chanted in monasteries 1,000 years later, whose name is given to children as a blessing, this person, in this moment, wept, completely, without management, without the practitioner's reflexive reach for the tool that might convert the experience into something more useful. He simply grieved his mother, in the ruins of her house, with her bones in his hands. Let that be the first teaching tonight. Grief does not become smaller because we have practiced. Loss does not become lighter because we have sat with impermanence in formal meditation. The heart that has loved something does not develop an immunity to losing it. The traditions that carry the deepest wisdom about the nature of mind do not claim otherwise. They do not offer grief-proofing. They offer something else entirely. And it always begins, not with the transcendence of the grief, but with its complete acknowledgement. He wept for a long time. And then, at some point that the tradition does not timestamp precisely, something shifted, not because the grief ended, not because an insight arrived and replaced the grief with understanding, but because, in the complete and unmanaged experiencing of the grief in the full contact with it, without the practitioner's tendency to observe it from a slight remove and note its characteristics, something underneath the grief became perceptible. The grief was completely real and completely present. And there was also, beneath it and around it and somehow inside it, something that was not the grief, something that was holding the grief, something that his teacher's transmissions had been pointing toward through all those years of caves and cold and nettle soup, and which he now encountered not as a transmission pointing at something, but as the thing itself, present and undeniable. He remembered his teacher's instructions. He does not describe what happened next in procedural terms, this practice, then this result, in the way a manual describes a technique. He describes it in the language of the songs he would spend the rest of his life singing, which is not the language of description, but of direct pointing. He says, "I blended my mother's consciousness with my mind and the wisdom mind of the Kagyu Lamas. I saw the real possibility of liberating both my mother and my father from life's round." What this means, in the experiential rather than the doctrinal sense, is something like this. In the moment of complete grief, the boundary between self and other, between the one who grieves and the one who is grieved, became permeable. Not dissolved, not erased, but permeable in the way that membrane becomes permeable under certain conditions, allowing passage in both directions. He and his mother were not separate in the way that the ordinary mind insists the living and the dead are separate. They were both held in something larger than the boundary. And that something larger, the awareness that contains both the grief and the one who grieves and the one who is grieved. All of it. Without choosing among them, that was what his years of practice had been preparing him to recognize. He set his mother's bones down carefully. He sat beside them for a long time, in the ruins of the house. As the afternoon light changed to the flat grey of early evening in the high altitude, the clarifying quality giving way to the softer indistinction of dusk, then he made a decision that the tradition records and that determined the rest of his life. He would go to the caves. He would not come back down until the work was complete. Not because grief had been resolved into something manageable, it had not. And it would not be. In the way that grief for a mother never entirely resolves into something manageable. But because the grief had shown him something, it had broken through the final layer of the practitioner's tendency to hold experience at a slight distance and study it. And in breaking through, it had deposited him in contact with something that needed no distance, that was in fact damaged by distance, that could only be met by being completely, unreservedly, unhesitatingly present with what was actually happening. He made a vow at his mother's grave. The tradition records that he built a proper grave, performing the appropriate practices for the benefit of her consciousness, and then he went to the mountain. The years that followed are the years of Milarepa, as the tradition knows him. The caves above the snow line, the nettle soup. The songs arising spontaneously out of practice and being given to whoever asked. The gradual gathering of students who came looking for the strange green-skinned yogi who lived where comfort was not available and seemed not to notice the lack. The teaching that emerged from those years was not a teaching constructed from study and scholarship, though Milarepa was not without learning. It was a teaching that had been metabolized through experience, through the full contact with every difficulty that his life had offered, including and especially the afternoon in the ruined house with the bones in his hands. This is what grief can do, when it is not fled from and not managed into something less than it is. It can break through the final defenses of the mind that studies experience rather than living it. It can deposit us, sometimes violently and without our consent, into the immediate reality that all the practice and all the study has been circling from a respectful distance. It can show us, not through explanation, but through the direct, irreversible fact of loss that we are larger than what we have lost. That what we carry in grief is also, somehow, a form of what was loved. That love and loss are not opposites occupying separate rooms but the same substance in different phases. The way water and ice and vapor are the same substance at different temperatures. You don't need to understand this tonight. Understanding is not what grief requires at this hour. What grief requires at this hour is what Milarepa gave it in that ruined house. Presence. Full, undefended, unhurried presence with what is actually here, the weight in the chest, the particular texture of the loss, the specific face or absence or ending that your body has been carrying through this day and this week and however long it has been. You don't need to transform it. You don't need to metabolize it into insight. You only need to let it be completely what it is, without the slight remove of the one who observes and studies and notes characteristics. Let it be felt. And as you feel it, let your shoulders soften, just slightly. Let the back of your neck release toward the pillow. Let your jaw unclench by one small degree. The grief is real, and you are larger than the grief. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. Feel the weight of your body on the surface beneath you, specific, substantial, held. Feel the breath arriving without your having to call it. Feel the temperature of the air and the particular quality of sound that your room holds at this hour. The specific texture of the silence around you. All of this is here. It has been here throughout everything tonight has brought. It is the wider room in which the grief is held, and it is steady, and it is patient, and it does not require anything from you in order to remain. If sleep finds you here, let it. You don't need to stay awake for what follows. The next story will carry itself, and something in you will receive it, whether attention is present or not. And if you are still here, still in the quiet, still in the particular wakefulness of the deep night that is different from the wakefulness of the early evening, that has its own texture and its own invitation, then know that we are now more than halfway through tonight's descent. What comes next is softer, less event, more space. We travel to Japan, to the late 18th century, to a small wooden hermitage on the lower slope of a mountain in Echigo province, where a monk named Ryokan had been living for many years in a simplicity so complete it had become its own kind of fullness. He wrote poems about the moon and the empty bowl and the children he played with in the village and the grief of autumn and the way that all of these things, the moon and the bowl and the children and the grief, were somehow, in his experience of them, The same thing, wearing different faces. He is waiting for us in the mist below the mountain. Let your breathing slow. Let your hands be open and still. Let whatever has been loosening in you tonight continue to loosen, at the pace it chooses, without being asked to hurry or to arrive at any particular destination. The destination is rest. And rest is already here, waiting beneath the wakefulness, the way the mountain is always there beneath the mist. In the Echigo province of Japan, in the mountains that face the Japan Sea coast of what is now Niigata Prefecture, the winters arrive with a thoroughness that leaves no ambiguity about their intentions. The snow comes off the sea in the late months of the year and piles against the stone walls and the wooden fences and the thatched roofs of the farmhouses with the patient accumulation of something that has all the time available to it. By the depths of winter, the paths between settlements disappear entirely. The cedar trees on the lower slopes hold snow in their branches until the weight becomes too much, and the branches release it in sudden white falls that make a sound like a held breath finally let go. The quality of silence in that landscape in the deepest part of winter is not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence of something large and patient and entirely indifferent to human preference, occupying the available space. In 1804, the 32nd year of the Kansei era in the Japanese calendar, a monk named Ryokan was living alone on the lower slope of Mount Kugami, in a small wooden hermitage called Gogo-an, the 5 measures of rice hut, named for the amount of rice he needed from a single day of begging rounds through the nearby village to sustain himself for the following day. He was 46 years old. He had been living in this hermitage, or in various states of proximity to it, for more than a decade. The hermitage itself was not much. A single room, perhaps 3 tatami mats in size, a sleeping mat, a writing table low to the floor, a small brazier for the coldest nights. Though Ryokan was not consistent about using it, he had, over the years, developed a relationship with cold that was not masochistic but simply practical, in the way that a person who has accepted certain conditions stops fighting them and begins, instead, to work with them. One wooden shutter that could be opened to a view of the lower mountain slope and the cedar forest below, and through a gap in the trees on clear days, a sliver of the grey-green sea in the distance, a shelf with a few texts, a lacquered bowl, cracked along one side in a way that had been mended with perseverance and now bore the repair as a feature rather than a flaw. He owned almost nothing else. This was not deprivation in the sense that implies a previous state of sufficiency being reduced. This was a chosen condition that he had arrived at through a long process of discovering what he actually needed in order to be what he actually was, which was a person for whom the space between things, the quality of light in the late afternoon, the specific weight of a snowfall on cedar branches, and the inexhaustible difficulty of writing a poem that was exactly as simple as the thing it described, constituted the primary business of existence. He had been born in this province, the son of a village headman of modest means and considerable local standing, a family that had expected him as families, in those times and in that social position, expected eldest sons to take his father's place eventually, to manage the household affairs, to continue the orderly transmission of one generation's responsibilities into the next. He had felt, from early in his childhood, a quality of wrongness about this expectation that he could not articulate and did not try to argue against, only lived alongside. The way one lives alongside, whether one cannot change. waiting for conditions to shift. At 17, he had entered the nearby Soto Zen temple of Kosho-yi as a novice monk. His family had not been surprised exactly, had perhaps, if his father was honest with himself, recognized the departure as the shape that had always been coming, the way you recognize a particular cloud formation before the rain arrives. He had trained at Koshoji for several years, and then a circumstance of extraordinary good fortune had presented itself. The great Soto master Kokusen visited the temple, and Ryokan had been so struck by the quality of Kokusen's presence, by what it was like to be near someone who was not performing serenity, but simply had it, the way a stone simply has its weight, that he had asked, with the directness of someone who understands that certain opportunities do not recur, to become Kokusen's student. Kokusen had accepted him. He had spent 12 years at Insuji Monastery in Tamashima, in Okayama Prefecture, 12 years in the formal training environment of one of the serious Soto establishments of the Edo period, studying the texts and the forms and the sitting practices with the rigor that genuine training requires. He had received, at the end of those years, an Inka, a formal certification of attainment from Kokusen, the document that declares, within the tradition's own framework of assessment, that the student has arrived at something real. And then, after receiving the Inka, he had done something that confused the monastery's administrative understanding of what an Inka was for. He had left, not to establish a temple of his own, not to take up a teaching position, not to acquire students or build a reputation or enter the institutional machinery of Japanese Zen. He had returned to his home province, to the mountain where he had grown up, and found the small hermitage on the lower slope of Kugami, and moved into it, and begun the life that would constitute his actual contribution to his tradition, which was not the transmission of doctrine, but the transmission of a quality, the quality of a life lived in complete simplicity, with complete attention, with the grief and the joy held so lightly and so equally that they became, in his experience of them, indistinguishable from each other. He wrote poems about this, hundreds of them. Over the decades of the Hermitage years, poems in Chinese and in Japanese, in the classical forms he had studied, and in looser, more personal forms that were closer to the speech of someone thinking out loud in the presence of something beautiful or sad. The poems were not famous in his lifetime. He did not seek publication or recognition. He wrote them the way he did everything because the thing was there and needed to be done and his hands were available. What the poems were about, underneath their surface subjects the moon, the autumn leaves, the empty begging bowl, the children who came to play with him in the village, was grief. Not grief as the dominant emotional register, not grief as the content, but grief as the water that everything floated on. The grief of impermanence understood not as doctrine, but as the texture of a particular afternoon. The grief of beauty, which is inseparable from the grief of its passing. The grief of a person who has chosen simplicity and therefore sees, with unusual clarity, how much is always in the process of being lost. He had never married. He had no family of his own construction. The hermitage was his household. The mountain was his landscape. The villagers who received him on his begging rounds and the children who ran to meet him when they saw him coming down the path were his community, held at exactly the right distance to be fully loved and fully received without the weight of obligation that closer arrangements carry. He played with the children in the fields, hiding and seeking, flying kites, rolling on the grass with a lack of monastic dignity that would have alarmed the administrators at Insuji, but that seemed, in the context of Kugami and the autumn afternoons, Entirely correct. He stole nothing from childhood except its attention. On an afternoon in the early autumn of 1804, he came down from the hermitage to do his begging rounds in the village and found, on the path between the cedar forest and the first farmhouse, that a thief had preceded him into the hermitage and discovered, as thieves who enter Ryokan's hermitage always discovered, that there was nothing to steal. The shutter stood open. The single room was undisturbed in everything except one detail. The sleeping mat had been moved slightly. Evidence of a search conducted with more hope than outcome. Ryokan stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the room. He looked at the open shutter, through which the evening light was coming in at the long angle of autumn afternoons, lighting the dust motes in the air above the writing table. Then he sat down at the writing table and wrote a poem. The poem was about the thief, and about the moon, and about what the thief had missed. The poem said, in the version that has come down through his manuscripts, the thief left it behind the moon at the window. He was not performing generosity in this poem. He was not making a teaching point about attachment. He was simply noticing with the quality of attention that had become his primary practice, more central than any formal sitting technique, that the moon was there, and that it was beautiful, and that its beauty was entirely available to anyone who looked, and that the thief had come into the room looking for something else and had therefore missed the one thing that was actually present. This is the quality that Ryokan spent his life cultivating and his poems attempting to transmit. The capacity to be present to what is actually here: moon, autumn leaf, empty bowl. The grief that moves through an afternoon like mist through cedar branches without flinching away from it and without grasping at it. Both movements being equally forms of not meeting it. He understood grief in this way, not as something to be overcome, or processed into understanding, or metabolized into equanimity, but as something to be met with the same quality of open, unguarded attention that he brought to the moon and the children and the bowl and the poem, that would not come right until the fourth attempt, when he finally stopped trying to make it do something and simply let it be what it was. In the winter of 1826, Ryokan became seriously ill for the first time in his life in a way that required more than the hermitage could accommodate. He moved into the household of one of his patrons, a man named Kimura Motuemon, whose family had supported Ryokan's practice for years, with the quiet generosity of people who understand that certain kinds of usefulness cannot be measured by conventional criteria. It was there, in the Kimura household, in the months of his declining health, that he met Taishin. She was a young nun, perhaps 30 years younger than he was, who came to care for him and who brought with her a quality of presence that matched his own in the specific way that certain presences match, not through similarity of personality, but through a shared orientation toward the things that matter. They wrote poems to each other, not love poems in the conventional sense, though they were also that. Poems that moved between grief and tenderness and humor and the particular clarity that comes when two people are in the presence of approaching death and have both decided, independently and together, to be completely honest about it. Ryokan knew he was dying. He did not treat this knowledge as a problem requiring solution. He treated it as a fact requiring attention, the same attention he had given to the moon at the window and the thief who missed it. The same attention he had given to the autumn leaves and the empty bowl and the children rolling in the grass. He was dying the way autumn arrives in Echigo, thoroughly, without apology, with a particular beauty that is inseparable from the fact of its ending. He wrote his death poem for Taishin, the version that has survived. In translation, says simply, "Now it reveals its hidden side, and now the other, thus it falls. An autumn leaf. He died in February of 1831. Tae-shin, who was beside him, recorded that he died as though falling asleep, seated in meditation posture, his face without tension, the last breath leaving without announcement. The autumn leaf falls, this side visible, then the other, then the ground. This is what the hermitage years had been preparing. Not the dramatic breakthrough of a sudden enlightenment that rearranges everything, but the gradual, patient, daily practice of meeting what is actually present: grief, beauty, cold, moon, empty bowl, sick body, approaching end with the quality of attention that makes all of it, somehow, sufficient, more than sufficient. The word Ryokan's tradition uses is not joy exactly, not peace exactly, but something that contains both and is damaged by neither: a quality of being fully alive to one's life, even as one's life is in the process of ending. Because all lives are in the process of ending. The hermitage on Kugami was always temporary. The autumn was always going to turn to winter. The thief was always going to come and find nothing and leave the moon behind. The monk who played with children in the village was always going to become the monk lying in a patron's house while a young nun held his hand. Ryokan understood all of this. He did not understand it as a consolation. He understood it as a description of what is actually happening, which is something different from consolation and more useful, because consolation asks grief to become something else, while accurate description simply asks it to be what it is, completely, in the company of someone who is not afraid of it. This is what tonight's darkness offers, if we are willing to receive it. Not the resolution of grief into something more bearable, but the company of a tradition of Ryokan and the hermitage and the moon at the window that has looked at grief and loss and the passage of everything that passes and said, without flinching, yes, this is what is happening. And it is, in its own way, complete. The autumn leaf shows this side, then the other. Then it reaches the ground, and the ground receives it. You are the ground tonight. Not the leaf, the ground. The thing that receives whatever falls, completely, without choosing what arrives and without refusing what does. The mountain slope below the hermitage that held the snow and the cedar roots, and the path of the monk going down to the village, and the path of the monk returning, year after year, in all weathers, with the bowl sometimes full and sometimes empty, and the quality of attention always present. That ground is what you are beneath the grief, not instead of the grief beneath it, holding it, larger than it, patient in the way that ground is patient, not as a virtue but as a nature. Feel that nature now. Feel the weight of your body, received by the surface beneath you without effort or selection. Feel the breath moving through you in and out, and in again without your having to decide each time that it should. Feel the specific temperature of the room around you, the particular sound texture of the silence, the quality of dark behind your closed eyes. All of this is the ground receiving you. And as you feel yourself received, let the jaw soften one more degree. Let the shoulders release toward the mattress. Let the hands open, just slightly, the fingers uncurling from whatever they have been holding. You don't need to hold it any tighter tonight. The ground is here. The holding can ease. If sleep comes now, and it may, in this softened place between one story and the next, let it come completely. You have done enough. The rest of these stories will continue without your active attention. And something in you, something older than attention, will receive whatever they carry. And if you are still here, still awake in the deep night way that has its own particular quality, neither the alertness of the evening nor the cloudiness that comes just before sleep, but the clear, slightly suspended awareness of the hours between midnight and dawn, then know that what comes next takes us somewhere different. We have been moving through stories of grief, actively encountered the Thai forest monk sitting with a grieving woman, the Tibetan physician kneeling at the ruins of his life, the Korean Seon master sitting in the dust of an emptied village, the Vietnamese king releasing the crown on the mountain path, the Tibetan yogi holding his mother's bones, the Japanese hermit watching autumn arrive in the cedar forest. Now we move into different air. We travel to 14th century Tibet, to a high retreat hermitage above the snowline, where a man named Longchenpa, whose name means the infinite great vast expanse of space, was writing his way towards something that is not the opposite of grief, but is what grief discovers, when it has been completely met, lies beneath it. Not consolation, not transcendence, something older than both. Let your breathing slow. Let the night hold you. The next story will find you wherever you have gone. In the mountains of central Tibet, in the region east of Lhasa, where the high ridges give way to a series of elevated valleys and then rise again into peaks that hold snow in all seasons, there is a place called Gangri Turkar White Skull Snow Mountain, where a scholar and poet and practitioner named Longchen Rabjam spent a significant portion of his adult life in the kind of retreat that is not the retreat of avoidance, but of arrival. The retreat of someone who has found, after extensive searching, the place where the searching can stop, not because the questions have been answered, but because the one who was asking has discovered something about the nature of questions themselves that changes the entire relationship between the asker and the asked. He was born in 1308, in the region of Tradruk, in the Yarlung Valley of central Tibet, the same valley where the first Buddhist temples in Tibet had been established centuries before. The ground of the tradition in a literal as well as metaphorical sense. His family background was one of modest means, but genuine education. He entered the Sangfu Nutok monastery at 12 years old and spent his adolescence in the intensive study that the great monastic universities of Tibet offered: logic, epistemology, the vast literature of Indian Buddhist philosophy that Tibetan scholars had been translating and commenting upon for centuries. The specific technical vocabulary of a tradition that took intellectual precision seriously as a form of respect for the truth it was attempting to describe. He was, by every account that survives, extraordinary at this. The kind of student who does not merely absorb a tradition but inhabits it, who moves through the texts the way a practiced reader moves through a language they love, attending not just to meaning but to the texture and rhythm of the thought, the way each formulation opens onto the next, the places where the language strains against what it is trying to say and reveals, in that straining, something about the nature of what cannot quite be said. He studied under many teachers. He received teachings from the great Nyingma masters of his time, including the transmission of the Dzogchen teachings that would eventually constitute the center of his life's work. He spent periods at different monasteries, absorbed different lineages, followed the threads of the tradition wherever they led, with the thoroughness of someone who is not collecting but integrating, building toward a synthesis that was not his own invention, but his own realization of what the tradition had always been pointing toward. And then, At some point in his middle years, the precise date is not recorded with certainty, he came to Gyeongheo and established the hermitage that would become his primary home for the rest of his life. The hermitage at Gyeongheo was not a comfortable place. Few hermitages in that tradition were. The altitude alone above 4,000 meters, where the air is thin enough that exertion requires deliberate management, and the cold at night achieves a clarity that is almost aggressive, in its precision would have disqualified most practitioners from considering it habitable. The terrain was rocky and spare, the vegetation reduced to the low-growing plants that can survive at that altitude. The water from snow melts so cold it hurt the hands. The view, on clear days, extended to distances that in lower altitudes would have been obscured by atmospheric moisture, ridge after ridge, receding into a blue so deep it was nearly purple at the far horizon. It was here, in this place of extreme clarity and extreme cold, that Longchenpa wrote. He wrote with the productivity of someone who understands that what needs to be said is vast and the time available is not. His principal masterworks, the Seven Treasuries, the Trilogy of Natural Freedom, the Trilogy of Rest were composed largely at Gyeongheo and at a second hermitage called Chimfu, in the same general region. These texts are not easy reading. They are the product of a mind that had absorbed everything the tradition offered and was now attempting to transmit not the content of that absorption, but the quality of the awareness in which the absorption had taken place, which is a different project, requiring different tools, making different demands on the language that attempts it. But there is one quality that runs through all of Longchenpa's writing that is immediately accessible even to someone encountering it for the first time. Without preparation or background in the tradition's technical vocabulary, it is the quality of space. Not space as a metaphor for emptiness, or space as an abstraction about the nature of mind, or space as a concept to be understood and placed in the correct relationship with other concepts. Space as a direct pointing at something that is immediately available, the openness that is already present in every moment of awareness. Before and beneath and around whatever content the awareness currently contains, the grief and the space in which the grief is held, the thought and the space in which the thought arises, the sensation and the space in which the sensation appears and changes and fades, the enormous, unchosen, uncreated openness that has been here through every experience of your life without ever having been made or earned or achieved. This is what the hermitage at Gyeongheo was for. Not to achieve the space it cannot be achieved. It is already present, but to stop, through the sustained conditions of retreat, mistaking the contents of the space for the space itself. In a particular year during his time at Gyeongheo, the sources do not agree on which year, and Longchenpa himself seems to have considered the calendar largely irrelevant to the project he was engaged in. A student came to the hermitage seeking instruction. The student's name was Sonam Drakpa, and he had traveled for 3 weeks from a monastery in the lower valleys, crossing 2 significant passes in weather that the season offered without apology. Carrying his practice texts and a small quantity of tsampa roasted barley flour and a grief so heavy he could feel it as a physical weight in the center of his chest. He had lost his teacher. Not recently, it had been 2 years, but in the way that certain losses do not diminish with time as others do. This one had remained exactly as present as it had been on the day it occurred. His teacher had been the organizing principle of his practice life for 12 years. The relationship had been of the kind that the tradition calls the most precious available to a practitioner, the direct, personal, irreplaceable connection between a student and the specific teacher through whom the living transmission of the teaching is received. His teacher had died in the early spring of the year before last, on an ordinary morning, without warning, in the way that deaths that come without warning arrive completely, with no preliminary softening. Sonam Drakpa had continued his practice. He had sat. He had performed the formal practices his teacher had given him. He had studied the texts. He had, in the outward form of things, done what a practitioner does when a teacher dies, continued. Because the teaching is larger than the teacher. Because the practice continues regardless of the personal circumstances of the one practicing. Because this is what the tradition says, and the tradition is not wrong. But underneath the continued practice, in the place where the practice had not reached, there was the grief, still exactly its original size, still in the center of the chest, still present when he woke each morning before he had time to arrange himself into the practitioner who was managing his life correctly. He climbed to Gangri Tokar on a morning in late autumn when the first significant snowfall of the season had covered the upper slopes, and the sky above was the particular blue that arrives after new snow, a blue so clear and saturated it seemed to have been recently made, as though the snow had cleaned the sky along with everything else. Longchenpa received him without ceremony. He had a student bring tea. He looked at the man who had traveled 3 weeks and 2 passes to reach him with the quality of attention that sees not the surface arrangement of a person but the weight they are actually carrying. "You are grieving," he said. "Not a question." 2 years. Sonam Drakpa said. "I thought it would be smaller by now." Longchenpa was quiet for a moment. Outside the hermitage, the wind moved across the new snow with a sound that was barely sound a breath, a suggestion. "Tell me," Longchenpa said, "where is the grief right now?" The student touched his chest. "And where is the awareness that knows the grief is there?" Sonam Drakpa paused. He had not been asked this question before, not in quite this form. "Here," he said. After a moment, "The same place." "Is it?" Longchenpa said. "Or is the grief in one place and the awareness of the grief, the knowing, the noticing, is that in a place, or is it more like the space in which the grief appears?" Sonam Drakpa was quiet. He looked at the question from several angles, the way you look at something in the dimness of an unfamiliar room, trying to determine its actual shape. "The space," he said slowly, not with confidence, with the careful honesty of someone who is reporting something they are noticing rather than something they already knew. "Good," Longchenpa said. "Stay with that. Not as a concept, as what is actually happening right now. The grief is here. What is the grief in? What holds it? What knows it?" They sat for a time in the silence of the high hermitage. The wind outside, the new snow settling. Sonam Drakpa attended to the question not as an intellectual exercise. He had enough training to know the difference, but as a direct investigation of what was actually present in this moment. The grief was there, completely there, unchanged, undiminished. The same weight in the same location that it had occupied for 2 years. He was not trying to remove it or diminish it or negotiate with it. He was asking a different question. What contains this? What is aware of this? What is the space in which this particular weight, this particular sadness, this particular love that has nowhere left to go, what is the space in which all of this is held? And in the asking, not in the answering. Because the question does not have an answer that the mind can formulate and retain and call knowledge in the pure asking. Something opened. Not the grief ending. The grief was still there. But a quality of the space around the grief, a quality that had been present all along, but that the grief had been occupying so completely that the space itself had become invisible, became perceptible. Vast, quiet, not empty in the sense of lacking content, but open in the sense of not being defined by its content. The grief was in it the way a cloud is in the sky, completely real, genuinely present, and not the sky. Sonam Drakpa looked up. Longchenpa was watching him with the expression of someone watching a person remember something they had always known. The grief is real. Longchenpa said, I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. The love was real. The loss is real. The weight in your chest is exactly as real as you say it is. He paused. And the sky is still the sky. Before the cloud arrived, while the cloud is here, after the cloud moves, the sky does not grieve the cloud. The sky does not hold the cloud. The sky simply is what it is, and the cloud appears in it, and is real, and moves, and changes, and eventually is not there. And the sky remains, exactly as it always was. Sonam Drakpa was quiet for a long time. My teacher, he finally said, is he the cloud or the sky? Longchenpa considered this with genuine attention. Your love for him was the cloud, he said. After a moment, what your love was pointing toward in him, and in yourself, and in the teaching that passed between you, that was always the sky. It is still the sky. Loss cannot touch the sky. Loss can only show you where you were mistaking the cloud for it. The wind moved outside. The snow settled on the rocks at the hermitage entrance. Somewhere in the distance, something, a bird, or the wind finding a gap in the stone, made a single, clear sound that arrived and departed without leaving any residue in the air. Sonam Drakpa stayed at Gangri Tokar for 3 months. He practiced in a small cave below the main hermitage, coming up periodically for instruction. At the end of the 3 months, he descended to his monastery. He did not return. He did not need to. What he had received could not be carried in a bag or written down in a form that would transmit the experience rather than the description of it. It lived now in the quality of his attention, in the capacity developed through those months at the hermitage, to notice the space in which experience arises rather than being entirely captured by the content of the experience. The grief was still there when he descended. It would be there for years, changing its shape gradually, the way all things change their shape gradually under the influence of time and attention. But it was held now in something he could feel not as a concept, but as a direct, immediate, available quality of his own awareness. The sky that holds the cloud, the space that holds the grief, the awareness that holds the awareness of loss, which is not a thing apart from the loss but its own dimension, always present, requiring nothing in order to be what it is. This is the teaching that Longchenpa spent his life at Gangri Tokar articulating. Not the elimination of grief or suffering or the difficult content of a human life. Not a technique for transcending what is painful, but the direct recognition available in any moment, in any condition, without special preparation, that you are not only the content of your experience, you are also, and more fundamentally, the space in which the content appears. The grief is real. You are larger than the grief. Not because grief has been diminished or resolved or transformed into something easier to hold, because the one who holds it, the awareness itself, the vast and unchosen openness that has been here through every experience of your entire life, is larger, was always larger, will remain larger after tonight. after this hour, after everything that this grief is still in the process of teaching. Feel that now. Not as a thought, as a quality of the space in which you are lying. The darkness behind your closed eyes is not empty. It is full of awareness. The same awareness that has been present through every moment of tonight. Reading or listening, drifting or attending, grieving or resting. That awareness is not the grief. It contains the grief. And it is fast. And it is quiet. And it is, in a way that no amount of loss can change, completely here. Let your breath arrive into that vastness. Let your exhale release into it. Feel the weight of your body held by the surface beneath you, and feel the awareness that registers that weight, that holds that sensation. That is larger than the body, and larger than the grief, and larger than tonight, and has been here the entire time. Just here. Just this. Just the awareness, resting in itself. Let your shoulders release fully into the mattress now. Let your jaw soften completely. Let your hands open and be still. The fingers uncurled. Nothing to hold. If you drift off now, that is perfect. You don't need to stay for what comes next. You have already received what tonight most needed to offer. And sleep is how the body absorbs what the night has given. And if you are still here, still in the particular quality of awareness that persists in the deep hours when the day's agenda has dissolved, and what remains is simply the fact of being awake in the dark, then know that we are moving now into the final phase of tonight's descent. What comes next is softer, less teaching, more drifting, less narrative, more breath. The stories will begin to dissolve at their edges. The way the last hours of the night dissolve into the early morning before light arrives, not dramatically, not with announcement, but through the gradual softening of the boundary between what is here and what is not quite here. We travel next to Vietnam, to the Mekong Delta, to a monastery garden in the early morning, where an old woman who has been carrying grief for 30 years is about to discover that she has been carrying it in her hands, and that her hands, tonight, are finally ready to open. You don't need to stay awake to receive her story. Let the awareness rest in its own vast space. Let the breath do what breath does. Let the night hold you completely, the way the sky holds everything that moves through it, without choosing, without refusing, without being changed by any of it. In the flat green country of the Mekong Delta, where the rivers move so slowly they seem less like rivers than like the ground itself, learning to flow, there is a quality of morning that belongs only to that place, a stillness that is not the stillness of emptiness but of fullness, of a landscape so saturated with water and green growth and the slow turning of the light across the rice paddies that the air itself seems to hold its breath. Not from tension, but from a kind of complete sufficiency. The lotus flowers in the monastery ponds open in the first light without ceremony. The way things that have been preparing all night finally do what they have been preparing for. The white egrets stand in the shallow margins of the canals at the edge of the property with the patience of creatures that have no argument with the pace of things. The banana trees at the boundary wall hold their broad leaves in the morning air without effort, the dew running slowly down their surfaces toward the base. It was into this particular quality of morning that an elderly woman named Ba Lian came each day to sit in the garden of the small monastery where she had lived for the past 11 years. She was 73 years old. She had come to the monastery not as an ordained nun, but as an upasika, a lay practitioner who had taken up residence with the community's permission following the death of her husband. Her children grown and established in their own households in the city. The house in the provincial town where she had raised her family sold, and the proceeds divided among them according to the proper customs. She had arrived with 2 cloth bags, a photograph, and a grief that she had been carrying for so long it had become, like the slight stoop in her shoulders or the particular way she paused at the top of a flight of stairs, simply a feature of the person she was. Something so thoroughly incorporated into the structure of daily life that she had stopped noticing it the way one stops noticing the weight of familiar clothing. Her eldest son had died 31 years before, at the age of 22. The circumstances of his death belonged to the history that the region carried, the way the delta carried its silt quietly, pervasively, distributed through everything rather than concentrated in any particular location. She had been 42 years old. She had been in the way of women of her generation in that part of Vietnam, a person whose interior life was not the subject of conversation or inquiry, who processed what needed processing in the early morning hours before the household woke, and who then rose and made breakfast and continued. She had continued for 31 years. She had not spoken of her son to anyone in the monastery. This was not secrecy. It was the long habit of a woman who had learned, across decades, that the grief was hers to carry, and that the carrying was something she did alone. Each morning she came to the garden before the first bells. She swept the path between the lotus pond and the Bodhi tree at the far end of the garden, a young tree by the standards of such trees, planted perhaps 40 years ago, its pale green leaves catching whatever early light arrived before the sun was fully up. She swept with the short-handled broom that had been given to her on her first morning at the monastery and that she had used every day since. A broom so worn by use that it had become specific to her hand in the way that tools become specific to the hands that use them. After sweeping, she sat on a low stone bench at the edge of the lotus pond and performed her morning practice, the recitations, the breathing, the sitting with the mind that arrived each morning with its particular weather. The practice had been given to her by the abbot in her first months at the monastery, a simple structure of breath and chant and sitting that asked very little of her philosophically and gave her, in return, 30 minutes each morning in which the ordinary work of managing her life could pause. She had been doing this for 11 years. The grief was still there each morning when she sat. She had stopped expecting otherwise. On a morning in the dry season, when the air had the particular clarity that comes before the rains arrive and everything seems sharper at its edges than it will be later in the year, a young nun came to the garden earlier than usual and found Balien already on the bench. Not in her usual posture of formal sitting, but leaning slightly forward, her elbows on her knees, looking at the surface of the lotus pond with an expression the young nun would later describe simply as, like someone looking at something very far away. The young nun, her name was Hue, and she had been at the monastery for 3 years. And she had the quality that some young practitioners develop when they have spent enough time in silence to become comfortable with it, sat down on the stones at the edge of the path without speaking, and looked at the pond too. The lotus flowers were not yet open. In the early morning before the light was fully established, they were still the closed forms they had been all night, the long green stems holding the pink buds above the dark water. Everything gathered into itself, waiting. They sat in silence for some time. A frog dropped from the bank into the pond. The egrets moved in the canal beyond the wall. Somewhere in the monastery building, someone was beginning the early chanting. Then Balin said, "Without looking away from the pond, I have been carrying something for a very long time." Hui said nothing. She waited in the way that genuine waiting is different from the performance of patience fully present, making no demands on what would or would not come next. "My son," Ba Ling said. "He died when he was 22 years old. He was the eldest. He had a way of laughing that I have not heard from anyone else since." She paused. "I have been carrying that particular sound for 31 years. The pond held the lotus stems and the dark water and the first faint reflection of the sky beginning to lighten. The closed buds were precise and still. I thought," Ba Lien continued, "that the practice would make it smaller. 11 years of practice. I thought the grief would become smaller." She was quiet for a moment. "It has not become smaller." Hui considered this with the honesty of someone who has not been practicing long enough to have comfortable answers, but long enough to distrust comfortable answers when she encounters them. "Has anything changed?" Hood asked. "In 11 years?" Balien was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a second frog dropped from the bank, and the ripples from the first had already settled, and the reflections had re-established themselves. "I think," she said finally, "I have become larger. The grief has not become smaller, but I think I have become larger." Hui looked at the old woman, the slight stoop, the worn broom leaning against the bench beside her, the hands in her lap with their decades of work visible in them. She thought about what she had just heard. "Lang Tai," she said softly, which is a Vietnamese expression that holds, in 2 syllables, something like good. "This is good. May it be so." Balin smiled. The smile was not the smile of someone who is being consoled. It was the smile of someone who has said out loud, for the first time in 31 years, something true, and found that the saying of it did not make the true thing less true, and did not make the grief less real, and also did not make her less whole. They sat until the lotus flowers opened. They opened, as they always did, without drama, the petals releasing from their nighttime compression, not in a single moment, but in a gradual, unhurried expansion, each flower proceeding at its own pace, the pink of the outer petals deepening as the light increased. By the time the first bell rang from the main hall of the monastery, the pond surface held dozens of open flowers facing the morning with the complete, unreserved availability of things that have no reason to withhold. Ba Lien looked at the open flowers for a long time. Then she picked up her broom and began to sweep the path again, as she had done every morning for 11 years, the same path. The same broom, the same slow strokes clearing the fallen leaves and the gecko droppings and the small debris that accumulated each night on the stones between the pond and the Bodhi tree. But something in the quality of the sweeping was different. Not the technique, not the pace, not the sound the broom made on the stones. Something in the quality of the hands doing the sweeping as though they had remembered, sometime during the morning's sitting, that sweeping a path is a complete act, that it requires nothing more than itself, that the path swept each morning is the same path swept each morning, and also never exactly the same path twice. Because the leaves that fall are different leaves, and the light is at a different angle, and the person sweeping has lived one more day and one more night, and is therefore, imperceptibly, continuously, and in ways that do not require dramatic transformation, not entirely the person who swept it before. The grief was still there. The sound of her son's particular laugh had not returned, and would not return, and she had known for 31 years that this was the case, and had carried the knowing along with the grief without expecting either to change. But she was larger. She had said it out loud, and saying it out loud had made it more true, not in the sense of creating something that had not existed, but in the sense of the mind finally receiving what the body had been doing quietly for 11 years, the patient. Daily, unremarkable work of becoming large enough to hold what cannot be set down. This is what the tradition she had entered, the Vietnamese Thiền tradition that Trần Nhân Tông had climbed Yen Tu mountain to found. That had understood from its beginning that practice is not separate from the ordinary motions of a life, but is the ordinary motions of a life attended to completely. This is what that tradition knew about grief. That grief does not require a solution. That the morning practice is not a technology for reducing grief to a manageable size. That the lotus opens not because the night has ended, but because the conditions are present. The water and the stem, and the light and the readiness that has been building through all the hours of darkness. The woman who sweeps the path each morning is practicing. Not practicing towards something that will make the grief stop. Practicing the being here that makes the grief something the body can carry without collapse, that makes the life, despite the weight it holds. A life that can also notice a frog dropping into a pond, and an egret standing patient at the canal's edge, and a young nun sitting in comfortable silence, and the particular way a lotus flower opens when the light arrives. The grief does not dissolve. The person does not transcend, but the path gets swept, and the flowers open, and the morning comes again, and the one who is present for all of it discovers not once, dramatically, but repeatedly, quietly, in the texture of each ordinary day, that being present for it is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. Let that settle now, not as a thought to examine, but as a quality of the body receiving the night. Feel the surface beneath you, steady and unremarkable, exactly as it has been for every minute of this night. Feel the breath, arriving without announcement and departing without fanfare. The same breath that has been doing this since before you knew you were breathing. Feel the particular weight of your hands, those hands that have been held and held things and let things go and held again, resting now. Open, receiving the small weight of their own stillness. You have been sweeping a path. Whatever you have been carrying, whoever or whatever you have been carrying it for, you have been showing up, day after day, with the worn broom and the morning grief and the practice that does not make the grief smaller, but makes you, imperceptibly and continuously, larger. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all. Let your breath carry that down below the level of thinking. Let it settle into the body the way the lotus settles into open when the morning arrives, not dramatically, not with effort, simply because the conditions are present. The conditions are present right now. Rest is here. The night is here, patient as the Mekong moving through the delta in the dark, unhurried, going where it goes, carrying everything that needs to be carried without being asked and without complaining about the weight. Let yourself be carried now. Let the breath move through you like water through open hands. Let the weight of your body release, completely and without reservation, into the surface that is holding you. Let the jaw soften. Let the shoulders fall. Let the space behind your eyes, that quiet, dark interior space, be simply what it is, vast and still and available. If sleep has been waiting for this moment, let it arrive. If you are still in the quiet wakefulness of the deep night, know that what follows now is softer still, a story from the island of Lanka, from an ancient forest monastery, where a monk who had been practicing for 40 years was about to receive the most unexpected teaching of his life from the most unexpected source. and the teaching had no words in it. It arrived the way morning arrives, not because anyone summoned it, but because the conditions were finally right. Let your eyes close fully now. Let your breathing slow, and slow again, and settle into the rhythm that the sleeping body knows without being taught. The next story is already beginning. You don't need to stay awake for it. Let it find you wherever the night has taken you, in the half-sleep, or the full dark, or somewhere between that has no name, but that everybody knows. In the ancient forests of the island that the Pali texts call Lanka, where the Buddhist teaching arrived in the 3rd century before the Common Era and took root in the red soil and the dense canopy and the particular quality of the island's light, with the thoroughness of something that had found the ground it was looking for in these forests. In the time of a particular monastery whose name the records have not preserved with certainty, there lived a monk named Nagasena, who had been practicing for 40 years. He was 63 years old. He had entered the robes at 23. In the way of men of his background and time, the son of a farming family in the hill country of the island's interior, where the tea had not yet come and the land was forest and paddy, and the particular terraced beauty of a landscape that had been shaped by many generations of careful human attention. His father had been a man of quiet religious inclination who gave generously to the monks who came on their morning rounds, and who had told his son, on more than one occasion, that a life given to the Dharma was the most useful life available. His son had listened with the attention of a boy who takes his father seriously, and had acted on what he heard, and had not regretted it. 40 years of practice. 40 years of the robes, the one meal before noon, the sitting periods in the early morning, dark before the forest woke to the full noise of the day, the walking meditation on the cleared paths between the trees, where the red earth was packed smooth by the daily passage of feet that had been walking the same paths for generations before his feet arrived and would continue walking them after his feet were done. 40 years of the Vinaya, the monastic code, observed with the attention that the forest tradition required, not as rule-following in the bureaucratic sense, but as the daily, detailed practice of a person who has agreed to live in a particular way and keeps that agreement with the consistency that any serious agreement requires. He was, by the assessment of the other monks at the monastery, accomplished. Not in the way that produces visible drama, no accounts of visions or spontaneous utterances, or the miraculous interventions that the popular literature of the tradition associated with high attainment. In the quieter way, a quality of presence that people in his vicinity found settling, a stillness that was not performed stillness but the natural expression of a mind that had spent 4 decades learning to stop arguing with what is. He had lost people. This is not always noted in accounts of practitioners' lives, but it is always true. His father had died 20 years before, his mother 12 years before that. 3 of his fellow monks, men he had practiced beside for decades, whose particular manner of walking and the sound of whose chanting voices he knew as well as he knew his own, had died in the years since he had taken robes. Each loss had been received with the equanimity that the practice had developed in him, genuine equanimity, not the performance of it, not the suppression of grief beneath a composed exterior, but the actual capacity to feel what was true and hold it within a space large enough that it did not collapse the one holding it. He thought of himself, in the honest interior accounting that a practitioner maintains, as someone who had made a reasonable peace with impermanence. Then the rains arrived early that year. In the 3rd month, weeks before the season's usual beginning. They arrived not gradually but all at once, the sky over the forest changing within a single afternoon, from the dry season blue to the particular grey-green of imminent rain. And then, the rain arriving with the kind of decisiveness that leaves no ambiguity about its intentions. In the third day of the early rains, one of the monastery's oldest trees, a fig tree at the edge of the meditation ground that the monks estimated to be somewhere between 200 and 300 years old. A tree so thoroughly established in that location that it had become a kind of landmark. A fixed point around which the life of the monastery oriented itself in the same way that a village orients itself around a well. This tree, in the third day of the early rains, fell, not slowly, not with warning. The rains had loosened the soil around the roots on the eastern side, and the weight of the canopy and the force of the wind combined at a particular moment to create a condition that the roots, despite 3 centuries of holding, could not accommodate. The tree fell in the night, when the monks were sleeping, and the sound of its falling, a long, tearing sequence of sounds that began with the underground tearing of roots and built through the cracking of the lower trunk and the thrashing of the canopy through the neighboring trees, and ended with the enormous concussion of the icha canopy hitting the ground. This sound woke every monk in the coast monastery. Nagasena had lain in his hut and listened to the sound and known, before he had risen to look, what had fallen. He had known by the size of the sound, which was the size of something that had been there for a very long time. In the morning, when the rain had lightened to a steady drizzle and the monks had gathered at the edge of the meditation ground to see what the night had done, he stood at the outer edge of the group and looked at what was there. The tree had been large enough that its falling had opened a significant gap in the canopy. Where there had been shade and the particular filtered light of an established fig tree, there was now sky, a disk of open grey sky, water-coloured, visible in a place where sky had not been visible in living memory. The fallen trunk lay across a third of the meditation ground, the root ball exposed on the eastern side in a tangle of red earth and pale root ends. The canopy on the western side already beginning to rain its own accumulated moisture onto the ground as the leaves adjusted to their new relationship with gravity. It was a large absence in a specific location. The monks looked at it. The abbot said a few words that were both practical and ceremonial. The tree would need to be cleared, which would be several days' work. The opening in the canopy would change the conditions of the meditation ground, which would require adjustment. He spoke with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who understands that impermanence does not require commentary. The monks dispersed to their morning tasks. Nagasena remained. He stood at the edge of the fallen tree and looked at the root ball. The roots that had been holding this tree in the red soil of this island for perhaps 3 centuries were pale and fibrous where they had torn. The inner wood, a creamy white that would darken as the day progressed. The smell of the torn earth and the torn wood was strong and specific. The raw smell of things opened that had been closed for a very long time. The rain continued falling on the exposed surfaces with the same application it brought to everything. He had looked at impermanence in formal meditation many thousands of times. He had contemplated the arising and passing of phenomena with the systematic thoroughness that the tradition prescribes, beginning with the breath, extending to sensation, extending to mental formations, extending to consciousness itself, attending to the arising, the presence, the passing of each wave of experience without clinging and without aversion, resting in the clear knowing that remains when clinging and aversion both release their grip. He had done this well. He would not have claimed to have done it perfectly. The tradition is cautious about such claims, and the caution is earned, but he had done it with genuine application across 40 years, and the doing had changed him in ways that were real and had been confirmed by teachers whose judgment he trusted. And standing at the edge of the fallen tree in the early morning rain, looking at the root bowl and the pale torn roots and the open sky where the canopy had been, something in him that the 40 years of formal practice had not quite reached became reachable, not because the tree's falling was more significant than other impermanences he had contemplated, not because the loss of a tree deserved grief in the way that the loss of a person deserves grief, but because the tree had been there, specifically and reliably and without drama, for the entire duration of his practice life at this monastery. He had walked around it 10,000 times. Its roots had been the boundary of the walking meditation path on the eastern side. Its shade had been the shade in which he had sat through summer afternoons when the heat made the open areas difficult. Its particular smell, after rain, the smell of wet fig leaves and the bark that had a quality slightly sweet and slightly bitter, had been part of the olfactory texture of every rainy season he had spent here. It had been here, and now it was on the ground, and the sky was where the canopy had been, and the rain was falling on the open disk of sky space with the same application it fell on everything else. He stood for a very long time. The other monks passed at a distance, attending to their morning tasks. None of them came to ask why he was standing there. Perhaps the quality of the standing communicated something that made approach feel unnecessary. Perhaps they understood, each in their own way, that the falling of the old tree required a certain amount of standing with, and that Nagasena was doing the standing with that the situation asked for. The rain continued. The light changed as the morning moved. At some point, a bird, a small, grey-brown bird of the kind that lived in the lower forest understory, unremarkable in its markings and its song, came and perched on one of the exposed roots of the root ball and looked at Nagasena with the complete lack of self-consciousness that birds bring to all their transactions with the world. The bird looked at him. He looked at the bird. The bird made a single, brief sound, not melodic, not the elaborate territorial or mating calls of the species, but the simple contact call that birds use to establish, "I am here," and then flew into the gap in the canopy and was gone. Something in Nagasena's chest released. Not dramatically, not with the quality of a spiritual event that requires recording, more like the way a muscle releases when it has been held in tension for a long time and finally receives permission to soften, the release happening before the decision to release. The body knowing what to do before the mind has finished deliberating. He breathed. The air that entered him in that breath carried the smell of wet earth and torn root, and the rain and the specific living smell of the forest in the early morning. And it entered him completely, without the slight resistance that had been present in his breathing for the past hour, without his having noticed it. And it moved through him and left him, and the next breath arrived. He sat down on the wet ground beside the fallen tree. Not on the path, not on the cleared meditation area, on the ground itself, the red earth wet through his robe immediately. He sat, not in the formal posture of meditation, in the posture of a person who has been standing for a long time and whose legs have decided that sitting is what comes next. His hands in his lap, the rain on his shaved head and his robe, and the fallen tree beside him, and the root ball, and the pale torn wood, and the open sky. He sat with the tree that had fallen, not performing a practice, not generating a teaching from the event to be delivered later to younger monks, not attending to the rising and passing of phenomena in the systematic way of 40 years, simply sitting with the fallen tree in the rain, the way you sit with something that has ended present, unhurried, making no demands on the ending that it become anything other than what it is. He did not know how long he sat there. Long enough for his robe to be thoroughly wet, which in that rain would have been perhaps 20 minutes. Long enough for two other birds to pass through the gap in the canopy above him, one pausing briefly on a branch of the fallen tree before continuing. Long enough for the quality of the light to shift as the morning moved further into itself. When he rose, he was wet and cold in the way that wet and cold are simply facts about the body rather than problems requiring solution. He stood beside the fallen tree for one more moment. He looked at the root ball and the pale roots and the sky in the place where the canopy had been. Then he bowed. A full bow, the monk's bow, hands together, the body inclined from the waist. The bow of a person in the presence of something worthy of acknowledgement. He bowed to the fallen tree, to the 3 centuries it had stood in that soil, to the roots that had held as long as roots could hold, to the gap in the canopy where the sky now was, to the rain falling on all of it with equal and indifferent care. Then he walked back to his hut and changed his robe and went to the meal that was waiting. That evening, a young monk came to him and asked, with the directness of the young, what he had been doing beside the fallen tree for so long. Nagasena considered the question. Practicing, he said. The young monk waited for more. Nagasena did not offer more. After a moment, the young monk nodded in the way of someone who has received an answer whose meaning they will understand later, and left. Nagasena sat alone in the evening, with the lamp burning at the low table and the rain continuing outside and the forest around the monastery making its nighttime adjustments to the new gap in the canopy, the air moving differently through the opening, the insects finding the changed conditions, the remaining trees gradually, over weeks and months, extending their crowns into the space the old tree had vacated. Loss makes room. This is not consolation. It is a fact about the way that living systems work, that the canopy closes over the gap, that the light that reaches the forest floor in a new place makes possible the growth of things that could not have grown in the shade, that the trees falling is not separate from the forests continuing. That absence is part of the composition, not a violation of it. He had known this. He had known it for 40 years, in the doctrinal sense, in the meditative sense, in the sense of a practitioner who has worked with impermanence as a formal object of contemplation. He had not known it until this morning, in the sense of a person sitting in the wet ground beside something enormous that had ended, bowing to what had been, because what had been was worthy of a bow. This is the teaching that the fallen tree offered, not in words. In the rain and the torn roots and the sky in the new place and the bird that came and looked at him and said, I am here. Grief knows this teaching. Grief has always known this. What grief knows underneath the weight, underneath the missing, underneath the years of carrying, is that what was lost was real. That the tree stood, that the canopy was there, that the shade was genuine shade cast by genuine leaves in genuine light, that the person who is gone was genuinely present in a way that changed the composition of everything around them. The way a tree changes the composition of a forest simply by being rooted in a particular place for a long time. And grief, in its deepest, most honest expression, is a bow, a full bow, the body inclined from the waist, in the presence of something worthy of acknowledgement. You are allowed to bow tonight, to whoever or whatever you are carrying, to the reality of what was there, to the specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable presence of what has ended. You are allowed to sit in the wet ground of your grief, without performing your relationship with it and without rushing it toward resolution, and simply be present with what has fallen. The forest continues. The gap in the canopy fills, slowly, over time, with new growth that would not have been possible without the opening. This is not a promise that grief will end or that loss will become smaller. It is only a description of what living systems do continue. Adjust. Fill the available light with whatever can grow there. The rain falls on the fallen tree and on the standing trees equally. The morning comes regardless. Let your breath be the rain now. Let it fall on everything equally, the grief and the rest, the loss and the continuing, the heaviness and the small mercies that appear even in the heaviest nights. Let your jaw be soft. Let your hands be open. Let the body release its careful holding and simply be held by the surface beneath you, by the darkness around you, by the vast, patient, utterly reliable fact of the ground. You don't need to be anywhere else tonight. You don't need to arrive at any understanding. You don't need to resolve anything or integrate anything or become anything other than what you are right now, a person lying in the dark, breathing, carrying what you carry, bowing in your own quiet way to what has been real. That is enough. That has always been enough. Let sleep arrive now, if it will. Let it come the way the morning comes to the forest, not because anyone summoned it, but because the conditions are present. And the darkness has done its work, and the body knows, in the wordless way that bodies know things, that rest is what comes next. The final story is already waiting. You don't need to be awake for it. It is barely a story, more a drifting, more a dissolving, more the last few minutes of the night before the light begins to change at the horizon and the birds in the forest start their first tentative sounds and everything that has been dark begins, almost imperceptibly, almost without announcement, to become something else. Let it find you wherever you have gone. Snow had been falling on the mountain for 3 days. Not the dramatic snowfall of stories, not the blizzard with its noise and its insistence, but the quiet, sustained, unhurried snowfall that high Korean mountains offer in the deepest part of winter, when the sky lowers itself to just above the tree line and releases what it has been holding with the patience of something that has learned not to hurry. The sound of this kind of snow is not the sound of weather. It is the sound of silence taking on a slightly different texture, of the world becoming, degree by degree, more of itself. In a small stone hermitage on the upper slope of a mountain in Gangwon province, a monk named Vulho had been sitting for 3 days. He was not sitting because he had decided to sit for 3 days. He was sitting because each time he had thought about rising, the quality of what was happening in the sitting had made rising seem like the wrong response to the situation. And so he had continued. The body had been fed once each day, a bowl of barley porridge that the young novice from the lower hermitage left at the door without knocking, understanding, with the instinct of someone raised in a practice community, that certain silences should not be interrupted. The body had done what bodies do in long sitting, adjusted, complained, adjusted again, eventually arrived at something that was not comfort but was beyond discomfort, in the way that very cold water, after long enough immersion, stops registering as cold and becomes simply the condition of the body in that moment. He was not a young man. He had been practicing in the Korean Seon tradition for many years, seated, walking, cutting wood, carrying water, practicing in the way that the tradition understands practice to mean, continuously, without separating the formal sitting periods from the rest of life. Attending to the huadu, not only in the meditation hall, but in the kitchen and on the path, and in the moments just before sleep, when the mind becomes soft, and the question, if held correctly, can sink beneath the thinking surface into something quieter. He had come to the mountain hermitage 6 months before, following the death of his teacher. Not dramatically, he had not fled to the mountain in grief, had not announced a retreat or established a formal structure. He had simply found, in the weeks after the funeral, that the lower monastery with its bells and its schedules and its communal meals and the faces of the other monks who had all known his teacher and who all, in their various ways, were managing the loss through the available means, he had found that this environment was not, for now, the right environment for what was happening in him. He had walked up the mountain with a cloth bag and moved into the small stone hermitage that the monastery maintained for solitary practice. He had settled. He had sat. The seasons had moved around him, the late summer heat giving way to the amber slowness of autumn, the autumn to the first frosts to the snow that had now been falling for 3 days. The grief for his teacher was not what he had expected grief to be. He had expected something more like the grief for his parents, which had been present and real, and which he had carried, and which had, over the years, changed its quality without disappearing. He had expected the familiar weight, the familiar location in the chest, the familiar sense of a presence that had been withdrawn. What he found instead was something quieter and harder to locate. Not the absence of a person, but the absence of a direction. His teacher had been, for 30 years, the orientation point by which he had calibrated everything, the practice, the understanding, the questions that arose and the way they were held, and the sense of whether the holding was genuine or performative. With his teacher present, there was always, beneath everything else, the knowledge that the orientation point existed, that if the compass needle was uncertain, there was a north to return to. Now the compass needle moved, and there was no north. Or rather, the north was still there, had always been there, was not located in his teacher, but in what his teacher had been pointing toward. He understood this. He had understood it for years, in the way that practitioners understand things that the tradition has been teaching them, correctly and clearly, for the entire duration of their practice. Understanding it had not made the disorientation smaller. So he had come to the mountain, and he had sat, and the snow had come. On the 3rd morning of the snow, before the light had fully established itself in the grey, pre-dawn quality that arrives in winter before sunrise, and that is not darkness and not light, but something between, a colour that has no name, because the language was made mostly in daylight. Fulho opened his eyes. He had not been asleep. He had not been in the concentrated intensity of formal practice. He had been in the space between these things that long retreat sometimes opens a quality of awareness that is neither the sleep mind nor the fully awake mind, but something older than the distinction between them. The space in which the two meet and discover they were never as separate as the waking mind believed. He opened his eyes and looked at the window. The paper screen of the window held the grey of the pre-dawn with the quality of a surface that has been absorbing light slowly for a long time and is now almost luminous with what it has received. Outside, the snow was still falling, he could tell by the silence, which had the particular density that continuous snowfall creates, each flake absorbing a small portion of the available sound until the world outside had arrived at a quiet, so complete it felt like presence rather than absence. He looked at the window for a long time. His teacher's face appeared to him not as a vision, not as an apparition, simply as the way the mind holds what it has loved. The specific shape of the face, the particular quality of the eyes in the moments when understanding was being transmitted rather than described. The hands, which had been the hands of an old man for as long as Vulho had known him, the fine bones visible beneath the skin, the deliberateness of their movements. The way they had rested in the lap during sitting, in a posture so completely settled, it looked like the hands of the mountain rather than the hands of a person. He looked at his teacher's face, the way you look at something you have looked at 10,000 times and are now looking at with the knowledge that the looking itself is a form of carrying. The snow fell. The light changed almost imperceptibly, the way winter light changes in the hour before sunrise, not brightening so much as becoming more itself, the grey acquiring a slight quality of warmth that announced, without announcement, that the sun existed somewhere beyond the clouds and the snowfall and was, in its own time, moving toward the horizon. Walho breathed. One breath. The kind of breath that a body takes when it has stopped managing its breathing and returned it to its nature, deep, unhurried, arriving from somewhere below the chest, filling the belly first and then rising. The exhale, releasing with the complete absence of retention that the fully relaxed body offers. He had been holding something. He had not known he was holding it. He had known, in the way of practitioners who have been sitting long enough to notice the difference between holding and not holding, that something was contracted, some quality of the breath, or the chest, or the interior posture that was slightly less than fully open. He had noticed it and had not pressed it, understanding that pressing is its own form of resistance and that the thing held releases in its own time when the conditions are right. The conditions, after 3 days of snow and silence and the grey light on the paper window, were apparently right. He exhaled. The grief was there in the exhale, not dramatically, not as a sob or a convulsion, but as a quality of the released breath, a warmth in it that was not only the warmth of the body but something else, some content that had been held in the breath for months and that now left with it, moving into the cold air of the hermitage without drama, without announcement, simply going. He breathed in again. The air that came back was cold and clean and carried the smell of the snow and the stone walls and the faint cedar of the wooden frame of the window. It was just air. It came because the body needed it. It filled him without effort and left again. Another breath. Another. Outside, the snow continued falling on the mountain, on the hermitage roof, on the path between the stone steps and the gate of the lower hermitage, on the branches of the pine trees that stood at intervals down the slope, on the larger trees below and the valley below those and the world below that, all of it receiving the snow with the same complete absence of preference that the snow itself brought to the falling. Vul ho sat, not practicing, not achieving, not arriving at anything or moving toward anything or completing any project that had a name. Simply sitting in the stone hermitage while the snow fell on the mountain, breathing the air that was available. Present in the way that presence is possible when everything else has been released, not because it was decided, but because the 3 days of snow and the grey light on the paper window and the exhale that had carried what it carried had created the conditions in which presence was simply what remained. His teacher was gone. This was true. The compass needle moved without a north to return to. This was also true. And the snow was falling on the mountain, and the light was becoming more itself at the edge of the horizon. and his hands were in his lap in the posture they had learned from his teacher's hands, and his breath was moving through him without effort. And the awareness that held all of this, the grief and the snow and the breathing hands and the light on the paper window and the cold air and the absence and the presence, both this awareness was here, had always been here, would be here when the snow stopped and the sun came and the path between the hermitages was dug clear and the world resumed its ordinary texture, would be here in the summer heat and the autumn amber and the next winter's snow and all the winters after that, whether Vulho was in them or not. This is the thing that cannot be lost. Not because it is permanent in the way that we wish permanent things would be permanent, reassuring, solid, available on demand, but because it is prior to impermanence. Before the thing that changes, there is the awareness of the changing. Before the loss, there is the knowing of the loss. Before the grief, there is the space in which grief appears. That space does not grieve. That space does not lose. That space holds everything that arises and releases everything that passes and is not diminished by either. The way the sky is not diminished by the clouds that move through it, or the stars that appear in it, or the storms that cross it, or the clear days that follow the storms. It has been here all night, this space. It was here in the Thai forest sala when the grieving woman touched her sternum and said, "Here." It was here in the Tibetan valley when the physician sat in the ruined house and kept his promise. It was here in the Korean village when the scholar monk sat down in the dust. It was here on the mountain path when the king turned toward the mist. It was here in the ruins of the mother's house when the bones were gathered with shaking hands. It was here in the hermitage on Kugami when the autumn leaf showed one side and then the other. It was here in the vast cold of Gangri Toka when the student felt the grief in the space that held the grief. It was here in the monastery garden when the old woman said, "I have become larger." It was here in the forest when the monk bowed to the fallen tree in the rain. It has been here this entire night. It is here now. It is what is reading these words, or hearing them, or floating through them in the half-sleep that has been approaching for the past hour. The edges of attention growing soft and permeable. The boundary between the listening and the dreaming becoming less a boundary and more a gradient. The one shading gradually into the other, the way winter dawn shades from grey to the first faint colour at the horizon. You don't need to hold anything now. Not the grief, not the understanding, not the stories, which have done what stories do, pass through you and left something behind that doesn't need to be named to be real. Let the hands open. They have been open for some time now, perhaps without your noticing. Let the jaw be soft. Let the breath move without supervision, the way it has been moving since before you were old enough to supervise it, the way it will move when you are asleep, the way it moves right now. Feel the weight of your body. Received. Feel the darkness behind your closed eyes, not empty, not frightening. Simply the darkness that the eyes make when they close. The interior dark that has been there every night of your life and has never required anything of you. The snow is falling on the mountain. Somewhere on a slope in Gangwon province, in a stone hermitage, a monk is breathing. His hands are in his lap. The paper window holds the last of the pre-dawn grey, which is becoming, very slowly, the first of the morning. He is not practicing. He is not achieving. He is simply here, in the way that the mountain is here without effort, without intention, receiving whatever arrives and releasing whatever goes, unchanged in its nature by any of it. You are here too, in your own room, your own dark, your own particular weight, on your own particular surface, carrying what you carry, breathing what you breathe. Here, in the way that here is the only way anything is ever anywhere. The grief is here, and the space that holds the grief is here. And you, the one who is aware of both, are here. That is enough. That has always been enough. Let the snow fall. Let the breath move. Let the light come when it comes, at its own pace, in its own time, without being called. And let sleep take whatever is left of this night and carry it somewhere the thinking mind cannot follow, somewhere the body knows how to go, somewhere the grief is received without commentary, somewhere the space holds everything and asks nothing in return. The snow is falling. You are held. Breathe and let go and breathe. Tonight, these stories have carried you across 7 traditions and 9 centuries of human beings sitting with what cannot be fixed. The Thai forest village where a grieving mother learned that the weight could be held differently. The Tibetan valley where a physician kept a deathbed promise. The Korean mountain where a scholar sat down in the dust of his own certainty. The Vietnamese slope where a king walked toward the mist rather than away from it. The ruins of a house in Gyeongheo where a son gathered his mother's bones in the afternoon light. The hermitage on Kugami where a monk watched the autumn leaf show one side and then the other. The high cold of Gangri Tokar, where a student felt the space that holds the grief rather than only the grief. The monastery garden in the delta, where an old woman said out loud that she had become larger. The Sri Lankan forest, where a monk bowed to what had fallen. And the Korean mountain, where snow fell on everything equally and a man breathed and let go. What these traditions say, in their different languages and from their different landscapes, is not the same thing, said different ways. It is the same thing discovered independently, across centuries and cultures, by people who sat long enough and honestly enough with the hardest experiences available to a human life to find what lies beneath them. Grief is not the opposite of love. It is love, with nowhere left to go, and the practice, across all of these traditions, is not to find grief a destination, but to discover that you are large enough to hold it without being consumed. That the one who carries the grief is larger than the grief. That beneath the weight, there is a ground. Beneath the ground, there is a stillness. And in that stillness, which has been here all night, which has been here every night of your life, there is something that has never been touched by any loss. Because it is prior to loss. Because it is the awareness in which loss appears. Because it is the sky that holds every cloud that has ever moved through it, unchanged by the moving. This is what the Kagyu masters called Mahamudra, what the Nyingma tradition called Dzogchen, what Ajahn Chah called the one who knows, what Ryokan pointed at with the moon in the window, what the old woman in the delta discovered in 11 years of sweeping the same path with the same worn broom, different names for the same open, unschosen, unreachable by lost space that has been here through every moment of your life and will be here after this night has become morning. Let that understanding settle now, not into the thinking mind, but into the body, into the heaviness of the hands, the softness of the jaw, the particular depth of the breath that comes when the body has finally agreed to rest. You don't need to carry what you've heard tonight forward into sleep. The wisdom of these traditions does not require your conscious curation. It absorbs the way warmth absorbs into the body, below the surface, doing its work without announcement. I spent a long time with these particular stories before I brought them here. The one that stayed with me most, the one I kept returning to without quite knowing why, was the simplest one. The old woman in the garden who said, after 31 years of carrying her grief, that she had not become smaller, she had become larger. I don't know why that particular sentence did what it did to me, but I wanted you to have it. I hope it went somewhere useful. Tomorrow, you may notice something slightly different about the way you hold what you're holding. Not lighter, that is not a promise anyone can make, but perhaps more spacious. Perhaps with the quality of someone who has been reminded, in the language of story rather than instruction, that they are not only what they carry, that they are also the one doing the carrying, and that the one doing the carrying is, and has always been, large enough. If tonight found you here, if something in these hours of stories offered even a few minutes of genuine rest, or a single thought that went somewhere real, please consider sharing this with someone else who might need it. A kamal, the simplest gesture, these things help other people who are carrying something find their way here. And I am genuinely grateful for that. Thank you for being here tonight. Not the courtesy thank you, the real one. For giving these stories your hours and your attention. For showing up in the dark with whatever you brought with you and letting the night hold it alongside you. May you sleep deeply. May whatever you are carrying find, tonight, a larger home in you. May you wake tomorrow with something, some quality of the ground beneath the grief intact. You are enough. You have always been enough. The snow falls on the mountain and the lotus opens in the morning, and the autumn leaf shows one side and then the other, and the ground receives everything that comes to it without choosing. You are the ground. Rest now.